Along the unyielding road of time, in the span between past and future, certain events have seized human imagination and shaped his worldview. One such event occurred not long ago, a colossal war waged with machines that scarred the land, seas, and skies. This is the tale of one such machine. The B-29's roots trace back to Boeing's Model 316 project, a direct successor to the XB-15 of 1934. Additional designs emerged over the ensuing years, with the 345 design formally presented to the U.S. Army on May 11, 1940. The Army was sufficiently impressed to grant Boeing funds for further studies and wind tunnel tests on June 17th. 3 years and multiple designs later, the first B-29s began rolling off the production lines at Boeing's Wichita plant in Kansas. By September 1943, 2 other major companies were producing B-29s alongside Boeing. Martin operated from its Omaha plant in Nebraska, while Bell built them in Marietta, Georgia. Together, these 3 facilities delivered a total of 2,513 B-29s. Measuring 99 feet in length and spanning 141 feet 3 inches, the B-29 was anything but small. In fact, it was the largest bomber in the world, with a wing area of 1,736 square feet. Coupled with a height of 27 feet 9 inches, the aptly named Superfortress stood as a towering giant, weighing 74,500 pounds empty and 135,000 pounds fully loaded. Building such a colossal aircraft required vast amounts of space and a meticulously organized construction system. On the factory floor, hundreds of specially trained workers toiled to construct an aircraft of immense proportions. This diverse workforce included people from all walks of life. Individuals worked side by side while the older teamed up with the young and younger. No one was too old to contribute or too young to matter. Every person brought a valuable skill, regardless of their shape or size. Once assembled, these frame sections came together to form the world's heaviest bomber, and getting such a machine airborne required immense power. That power came from 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone 18-cylinder radial engines, each equipped with GE turbo superchargers, delivering 2,200 horsepower at takeoff and 2,300 horsepower at 25,000 feet. The frame supporting these engines had to be expertly constructed. A single missed rivet, combined with vibrations from the engines, could cause the entire plane to break apart mid-air. Once fully assembled, the B-29 was nearly ready to depart the plant. Only minimal finishing touches remained, as it was built as a machine of war, requiring little in terms of paintwork or aesthetic details. On a production line like this, completed planes didn't remain idle for long. The moment the final rivet was secured, the B-29 was towed out of the factory and handed over to the men who would ultimately gamble their lives on its reliability. The pilots destined to fly these formidable warbirds left nothing to chance. The B-29 underwent a rigorous series of tests before its first flight. Every inch of its exterior assembly had to be meticulously inspected by the pilot and crew, who ensured nothing was overlooked. Tire pressure had to be precise, maintained between 75 and 85 pounds per square inch. Detailed measurements were taken to confirm that no moving parts had shifted beyond acceptable limits. At a cost of $639,000 per plane, caution was essential, requiring a thorough inspection of every component, no matter how minor. As the pilot walked around the aircraft, he carefully examined the bodywork for any defects. After verifying the tire pressures on the next wheel, the pilot carefully inspects each motor cable, checking for any signs of damage or breaks. These motors control the landing gear, and a failure here could prove catastrophic. Once the wiring is inspected, the pilot examines the brake lines, ensuring the hoses are intact and free of leaks. Next, the wheel chocks are checked, one positioned behind the inboard tire and another in front of the outboard tire. The B-29 carried an immense 9,438 gallons of fuel distributed across 26 wing tanks and 4 bomb bay tanks. A leak in any of these tanks could trigger a devastating fireball. The aircraft also boasted a formidable array of onboard weapons. Within the versatile remote-controlled turrets positioned around the aircraft lay 50-caliber machine guns, each requiring meticulous inspection. With its outer shell removed, the belly turret exposed the weapon housed inside. These turrets enabled the guns to be angled in multiple directions, operated remotely from within the aircraft. Routine maintenance of both the gun and turret was vital to ensure the safety and effectiveness of the operator. For obvious reasons, extra care was given to inspecting these critical components of the aircraft. The B-29 was not built as a fighter, and while it could reach speeds of up to 357 miles per hour, it couldn't outpace faster enemy fighters. Fortunately, its designers anticipated this and equipped the plane with 8 separate remote-controlled gun turrets. An enemy wouldn't take down a B-29 without a fight. The designers also added another innovative feature: cameras installed in some gun turrets. These captured footage of the B-29's guns in action, providing tactical insights at the time and, 50 years later, offering historians a valuable glimpse into the war. The B-29 truly had a sting in its tail. 2 50-caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon for good measure. While these guns shared a similar range of motion to those in the turrets, the cannon's shell trajectory differed from that of the machine guns. This disparity made aiming challenging, leading to the cannon's eventual removal from the tail section. Before boarding the aircraft, one final task remained: the crew. Each crew member had to be checked in and thoroughly briefed by the pilot. A few choice words of encouragement were usually enough to lift their spirits and prepare them for the task ahead. This would be their last chance to feel the ground beneath their feet for several hours. Once everyone was present and accounted for, it was time to board. Upon entering the plane, the crew immediately headed to their stations and made themselves comfortable. Anything they brought with them had to be securely stowed, and the exterior hatches sealed tight. This was especially crucial for the B-29, as it featured pressurized compartments that maintained consistent air pressure throughout the mission. The pilot couldn't do much until he established contact with the rest of the crew. Starting with his throat microphone, he would put on his headset and plug it in. By flicking a few switches and turning the transceiver to the right frequency, he would establish communication with the control tower. Next, the pilot would conduct a brief check of the gas mask and inspect the portable oxygen cylinder. He would then test the cockpit lights and ultraviolet lights, flicking them on and opening the shutter for a visual inspection. Following that, he'd give a quick blast on the alarm bell, and the gun commander would confirm its functionality. Every internal system underwent this thorough check. It was now time to start the engines. Each engine had to be turned through 15 blades before it could be started. Once this procedure was completed, the ground crew would step back and the pilot could start the engines. After all 4 engines were running, vacuum pressure became available to operate the gyro flight instruments. At this point, the gyro compass and flight indicator were uncaged and set to the correct settings. A few more checks and procedures remained before taxiing out onto the runway. Not long now, and the airmen would be airborne. With wheels up, the co-pilot raised the wing flaps, and a visual check confirmed they were properly set. It was time to see what this bird could do. The bombardier took a quick look, but no bombs would be dropped today. This was just a test flight. Time to head in. Wing flaps down. Now, let's see how well she lands. The wing flaps must be fully extended for the approach. A textbook landing. The back wheels touch first to absorb the impact, followed by the front wheel coming down gently. It doesn't get much smoother than that. This was just a test flight, and these airmen had an easy ride. However, 10,000 miles away, a fierce battle was raging, and soon these men and their brand new B-29 would be called into action. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, they made a powerful enemy out of America. The reasons for the attack were unclear, and ironically, Japanese envoys were holding peace talks in Washington at the time. However, that one fatal mistake brought America into the war, and U.S. troops were soon engaged against the Japanese. To bring their B-29s closer to Japan, America needed an airbase large enough to accommodate them. On the Pacific island of Saipan, they found such a place. After landing on Saipan on June 15, 1944, U.S. Marines captured the island's airbase within 3 days. However, the Japanese defenders continued to fight, and the battle didn't end until July 9th. By then, an estimated 30,000 Japanese soldiers and civilians had lost their lives. Some, including 2 commanders, chose to commit suicide as defeat neared. U.S. casualties numbered over 16,000, with 3,000 dead. The Battle of Saipan secured America its airbase and wouldn't be long before the first B-29 would arrive. But before that, bulldozers would be sent in to prepare the runway. Other airfields were also being readied in eastern China. 500,000 Chinese farmers and laborers transformed acres of paddy fields into runways specifically designed for the B-29. These dedicated workers used nothing but their bare hands and the simplest of tools. No pair of hands went to waste in this operation. 3 months later, the skies were filled with B-29s heading east. For the men aboard these massive bombers, there was only a silent farewell to the California sun, and perhaps a prayer for their safe return. But farewells couldn't last long. There was still work to be done, and unless they wanted to run out of fuel over open sea, these men had to stay vigilant about their course heading. For a while, all they had to look at was the endless expanse of open sea. That, and the couple of hundred other B-29s flying alongside them. The view could get monotonous, with nothing but sea and sky for miles, and the only comfort was looking out the window at their fellow airmen. Land. The relief on this pilot's face says it all. The long journey from America to Saipan has finally come to an end. While the sight of the base is the best thing these pilots have seen all day, it won't be long before they'll long for the comfort of home. The ground crews have been waiting for the arrival of their comrades for a long time. And for the dust-covered residents of Saipan, the crews of these first planes are the best sight they've seen in months.
The first element of the 21st Bomber Command has arrived. When we've done some more fighting, we'll do some more talking. Thank you.
These pilots and their crews have just landed, but already they're receiving a hero's welcome. Maybe they'll return to America, covered in glory. Or perhaps their celebrations won't last long, nor will their rest. At the 21st Bomber Command headquarters, plans for their first mission are already in motion. Today, the target is Tokyo. The weather's too cloudy to strike anywhere else. Major General Curtis LeMay believed he could force Japan's surrender through the sheer weight of relentless attack. To this end, he ordered a rapid pace of operations. 4 wings will strike Tokyo at 10 o'clock. They'll fly in under the weather and bomb at 12 noon. Operations has reviewed the tactical plan for Target 574. General LeMay approves the target and commits all executive details to his staff. By flying 600 plane missions out of Saipan, Guam, and Tinian, LeMay doubled his command's bombing weight in just 2 months. That was his no-nonsense style. With the increased frequency of LeMay's attacks on Japan, it became essential to carefully track the amount of bombs and ammunition being used. The B-29 could carry 20,000 pounds, or 4 tons of bombs, and when you multiply that by the number of planes in operation and the number of missions flown, it's clear how much planning was needed to manage the distribution and usage of these weapons. Another key aspect of LeMay's tactics was keeping as many B-29s in operation as possible. This meant a lot of work for the engineers who maintained the B-29's engines. The pilots, who not long ago had arrived, fresh-faced and eager, were now veterans of several missions over Japan. Some had already seen action in Europe, while others were more innocent. It's a testament to their courage and resilience that, in the face of potential early death, these men could so easily throw their heads back and laugh. Men like Colonel Kenneth Gibson from Salt Lake City, who served in both England and the Far East, John Van Trigg from Illinois, Gordon Wong from Idaho, Fred Montgomery, a B-24 gunner, Harry Grant, a B-17 flight chief, decorated for his actions in the battles of Guadalcanal. Men who had flown in forts or liberators across various combat theaters and had graduated to the newest and best. It had been a long time since any of them had seen their homes or loved ones. In the pilot's briefing room, the Tokyo mission is laid out for them. The news comes as a relief to these men, but they are under no false illusions. Many of them have flown missions to targets in Europe, but this is different. The London to Berlin run was 1,000 miles, there and back. A return trip from Saipan to Tokyo covers 3,000 miles over enemy territory. Before the mission, the pilots endure a few moments of unwanted leisure. They are eager to get airborne, but until final clearance is given, there is nothing to do but wait. The lead plane for this mission will be Don Pistote, piloted by Robert Morgan, with Bombardier Vince Evans on board. They were the pilot and bombardier who flew 25 missions over Germany in a B-17 called the Memphis Belle. They could have gone home after their service, but they chose to continue serving. At last, the green light is given, and these two heroes can take to the skies once more. During the mission, the crew members are confined within separate pressurized sections of the aircraft. The bombardier sits at the nose of the craft, directly ahead of the pilot on the left and the co-pilot on the right. Behind the pilot is the navigator, facing forward. The flight engineer sits directly behind the co-pilot, facing up. The radio operator is across from the navigator, facing the right wall. The gun commander is positioned at the top of the fuselage, amidst the ship's structure. The left gunner faces aft, as does the right gunner. The tail gunner stays at the rear of the craft, moving to the tail when combat begins. When the B-29 came under attack from enemy fighters, it was the P-51 Mustang that provided protection, acting as a long-range escort and close air support fighter. The B-29's gun commander didn't remain idle. The gun commander had control of all the B-29's guns and was fully capable of dispatching enemy fighters when necessary. From his vantage point at the top of the fuselage, he could see enemy fighters approaching and had the time to choose the most effective turret to control. The other gunners also had control over their respective turrets, coordinating to launch a devastating counterattack. The B-29 was equipped with 10 50 caliber machine guns, each carrying 500 rounds, and a 20mm cannon in the tail with 100 rounds. The total onboard firepower amounted to 7,000 rounds. From the gun blisters, the gunners could aim and fire with deadly precision. Now, the B-29s had reached Tokyo and were rapidly approaching their target. At this point, the bombardier would take control of the plane, using his scope to locate the target and begin the bombing run. Once the cloud cover cleared enough for the bombardier to visually confirm he was above the target, the order was given to open the bomb bay doors. The bombardier took a final moment to ensure his position was accurate, and then, with a quick decision, released the bombs. Bombs away. It took 3 days for the smoke to clear after the attack, and only then could the true extent of the damage to Tokyo be assessed. The sight of Japan's devastated capital served as a grim reminder of the destructive power of war. The B-29 crews, however, were unaware of the full extent of the damage they had caused. All they knew was that they had successfully completed their mission and taken out a key enemy target. They had flown for Uncle Sam, and now they were flying for themselves. The journey back to Saipan was a grueling 1,500-mile flight, and throughout the entire return leg, the victorious B-29s remained in constant danger of attack. Just flying an American bomber over Japanese airspace was enough to provoke enemy fighters. But on this particular return flight, the threat came not from intercepting fighters, but from flak. A lucky pilot might only lose the use of one engine after taking a hit from flak, and as long as the landing gear remained undamaged, he stood a good chance of making a safe landing. Unfortunately, this crew wasn't so fortunate. Their plane came in uncontrollably, its engines severely damaged, and the landing gear was crippled. The man who stood watching this devastating accident might have experienced a mix of emotions, but his lack of visible response suggested that he had seen similar events happen before. Some pilots in dire situations like this found a convenient stretch of water to splash down on. The pilot of the damaged B-29 made a wise decision, choosing to bring his plane in for a controlled landing on water rather than attempting a parachute escape. The pressurized compartments of the B-29 made a quick evacuation nearly impossible. Miraculously, the pilot managed to land the plane with perfect control, and all crew members survived. The aircraft would soon sink and become part of the ocean's ecosystem. For the crew of the second plane, what initially seemed like a routine landing turned into a tragic disaster. While the exact cause of the crash remains unknown, the fire crews responded quickly, aware that the vast amounts of aviation fuel on board could make the fire much more dangerous. Despite their efforts, the blaze was fierce and hard to control, requiring gallons of foam and a team of dedicated rescuers to try to save the crew. Sadly, only one member of the plane's crew was rescued from the burning wreckage, a stark reminder of the risks faced by these airmen in combat. As the B-29s carried out their missions, the efforts to extinguish the aftermath of their attacks, often involving intense fires from aircraft fuel and other incendiaries, became a regular part of the battle. Fire crews, working tirelessly through the night, had to combat blazes that could destroy entire aircraft with a single spark. Despite the terrifying risks, most of the B-29s returned home, having survived their perilous missions and the dangerous elements of warfare. The impact of LeMay's relentless bombing campaign was undeniable. Japanese cities and villages were left in ruins, and the death toll soared as a result of the constant bombardment. However, rather than crippling Japan's resolve, the attacks had the opposite effect, provoking a fierce response. With their backs against the wall, the Japanese forces regrouped, becoming more determined and increasingly dangerous. As LeMay's policy of hit 'em hard continued, Japan's resistance grew, setting the stage for an even fiercer conflict in the skies. On August 6, 1945, Colonel Paul Tibbets and his crew aboard the Enola Gay prepared for a mission that would change the course of history. The aircraft had been specially modified to carry a solitary, unprecedented payload. Tibbets is carrying Little Boy to Japan, and its mission is a closely guarded secret. Inside Little Boy lies a terrifying power, one that is unleashed only when an atom is split. A force equivalent to 20 kilotons of destruction, ready to strike Hiroshima. The atomic bomb. On August 9th, a second bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on Nagasaki from Boxcar, adding its devastation to bring the death toll to 110,000. On August 10th, the Japanese emperor communicated Japan's desire for peace, and on September 2nd, 1945, Japan officially surrendered aboard the USS Missouri, marking the end of the war. It took 2 atomic bombs to secure Japan's surrender, but after 6 years of brutal conflict, the countless men who had fought for their nations could finally return home. Japan's surrender marked the end of a dark chapter in history. The B-29 pilots and crews had fulfilled their duty for Uncle Sam, and now they flew not just for themselves, but for home. The promise had been kept, the hopes of many were realized, and for some, beneath the war-torn flag, a new promise awaited, the promise of peace.
He was born in Columbus, Ohio, just 50 miles from the Wright brothers' shop in Dayton. He saw his first airplane at the age of 4. It fascinated him, and he ran to catch it, but it was gone. From then on, he was fascinated by flight and continued to chase it. After college, he joined the Army and became a pilot. The chase that began at age 4 was fulfilled, and for the next 40 years, aviation would bring him fame and achievement through a long and glorious career. He was always the best bombardier, best navigator, and best pilot in his unit. He developed the tactics to win wars from the air, then led the way as the Army Air Forces smashed Germany, then Japan on their way to victory in World War II. When the Soviets became a menace, he thwarted them by first organizing the Berlin Airlift, then developing the Strategic Air Command into the world's premier nuclear deterrent bomber and missile force, dedicated to the preservation of peace, a peace that lasted for over 40 years. His name is Curtis Emerson LeMay, and he is a legend of air power. Curtis LeMay was born November 15, 1906, to Irving and Arizona LeMay. His father was a steel worker and sometimes handyman, who often was forced to move his family in search of work. Their travels carried them from Ohio to Pennsylvania to Montana to California and back again. While in California, young Curtis and the rest of his family visited the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco. Young Curtis saw aeronaut Lincoln Beachley do aerobatics over the crowds, and he wondered just what it was like up there, a wonder he would never lose. LeMay graduated from Ohio State University in 1928 with an engineering degree. He also finished ROTC as an honor graduate and received a reserve commission in the Army. Unfortunately, the reserve commission didn't help land him in flight school. He worked hard to enter flight training as an aviation cadet at Kelly Field, Texas. His first tour of duty was with the 27th Pursuit Squadron at Selfridge Field, Michigan, where he received his regular commission in February 1930. At Selfridge, LeMay flew the Curtiss P-1. He stayed at Selfridge until 1937, when he transferred to Boeing B-17 bombers at Langley Field, Virginia. In February 1938, Lieutenant Curtis LeMay was lead navigator when the Air Corps demonstrated the long-range capability of its new B-17. 6 bombers of the 2nd Bombardment Group made a goodwill flight from Langley Field, Virginia to Buenos Aires, Argentina, and back. General Hap Arnold awarded the group the McKay Trophy for the most meritorious flight of 1938, and LeMay was there. Just 2 months later, 3 B-17s of the 2nd Bombardment Group intercepted the Italian liner Rex, 725 miles out, headed for New York City. The Air Corps demonstrated that it could intercept an enemy fleet threatening the United States at vast distances, long before they became a threat. Once again, the lead navigator was Lieutenant LeMay. Just prior to World War II, LeMay, assigned to Ferry Command, pioneered ferry air routes over the South Atlantic to Africa and over the North Atlantic to England, routes that would be used constantly once the war began. LeMay then took over the 305th Bombardment Group, trained them in California, and took them to England in the fall of 1942. He gained a reputation as a tough commander, the Iron Eagle. But no matter how tough, he was fair and made sure his crews were well taken care of. LeMay once commented, "I don't mind being called tough. In this racket, it's the tough guys who lead the survivors."
Curtis LeMay was an individual who had very high standards that he held himself to, and he held the people that worked for him to. He was fair. He was uncompromising in his pursuit of quality, in his pursuit of performance. He had a reputation for being abrupt. He was a man who was very performance-driven and very goal-oriented and very results-oriented. He was uncompromising in the way that he viewed his own performance and the performance of those who worked for him.
He trained his crews hard and prepared them well, and through them he developed new formation tactics. These tactics greatly improved defensive protection for the bombers from fighter attack. The tactics also improved the group's bombing accuracy and effectiveness.
I found that bombing accuracy was very poor. As a matter of fact, we didn't know where half the bombs we hauled across the channel fell. And further investigation showed that everyone was taking evasive action on the bombing run. So it was apparent that the bombardiers were not having an opportunity to use their equipment and get good results. So in our stupidity, we decided to make a straight-in run from the time we saw the target.
His bombers flew as an 18-aircraft combat box for mutual protection. They all dropped their bombs when leads were dropped, so that the bombs fell in a tight grouping, known as synchronous bombing. LeMay's tactics were adopted by all groups in all theaters of operation. He excelled as a combat leader, prompting General Ira Aker to say of LeMay, "He may not be human, but when I can find 100 other group commanders like him, we'll get on with this war. We might even win it." LeMay was quickly promoted to 4th Bombardment Wing Commander, and in August 1943, he planned and led the famous shuttle mission from England to Africa, in which they bombed the Messerschmitt airplane factory at Regensburg, Germany. Other bombers in the attack hit the ball bearing factories at Schweinfurt. Although successful, the mission lost 60 bombers and another 100 were damaged. month later, LeMay became the 3rd Bombardment Division commander, making him the youngest major general in the Army. His next move came in August 1944, when General Arnold selected LeMay to command the 20th Bomber Command in India. It was time to take the war to mainland Japan, and LeMay planned to do it with the new Boeing B-29 Superfortress. As action began to taper off in the China-Burma theater, LeMay was appointed commander of the Marianas-based 21st Bomber Command in January 1945. The B-29s could now hit mainland Japan with relative ease. From his headquarters on Guam, LeMay directed the bombing campaign. Initially, LeMay used the European tactic of high-altitude flights with high-explosive bombs against targets in Japan. Then, in an effort to shorten the war, he changed tactics. Realizing that Japanese construction was primarily wood, he sent his bombers in between 5,000 and 7,000 feet with incendiary bombs. The results were catastrophic for the Japanese, as many of Japan's major cities were consumed by fire. Unbelievably, the fires did not bring the unconditional surrender intended. President Truman gave the order to use the atomic bomb. On August 6, 1945, the Enola Gay, a B-29 from the 509th Bomb Group at Tinian, dropped its 9,000-pound little boy on Hiroshima. After a visit with LeMay, General Carl Spaatz telegraphed Washington, "Have had opportunity to check up on Baker 2-9 operations and believe this is the best organized and most technically proficient military organization the world has seen to date." Just 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped, this time on Nagasaki. On August 15th, the war was over. The bombers of LeMay's command had helped bring it about. Major General LeMay became the first Deputy Chief of Air Staff for Research and Development at Air Force Headquarters in Washington in December 1945. He was in charge of nuclear weapons development and wasted no time in planning the weapons testing in the Marshall Islands Bikini Atoll. LeMay was promoted to Lieutenant General in October 1947 and assigned as Commanding General for U.S. Air Forces in Europe. In April 1948, the Soviets began to restrict the flow of supplies to Berlin, prompting General Lucius Clay, the commander of European Command, to ask LeMay if he could deliver coal by air. LeMay responded, "Sir, the Air Force can deliver anything." LeMay immediately began Little Lift from Rhine-Main, West Germany, to deliver U.S. Army rations and perishables like fresh milk, eggs, and vegetables daily into Tempelhof Aerodrome Field in Berlin. LeMay organized the air operation and ordered more modern aircraft. Until they arrived, he had to rely on the 96 Douglas C-47s already assigned to Germany. Then on June 26, the Soviets closed the city completely, except for the air corridors. The Berlin airlift began. With the airlift flowing efficiently, LeMay returned to the United States, was promoted to general, and assumed command of the newly formed Strategic Air Command. He established its headquarters at Offutt Air Force Base, Nebraska. He transformed the command from the remnants of World War II bombers, primarily the B-29 Superfortress and the larger consolidated B-36 Peacemaker intercontinental bomber, to an all-jet bomber force, comprised of the sleek Boeing B-47 Stratojet and the awesome Boeing B-52 Superfortress, manned and supported by professional airmen dedicated to the preservation of peace. As the new Boeing bombers came into service, LeMay quickly checked out in both the B-47 and the B-52. General LeMay commanded the Strategic Air Command for nearly 9 years. He was uniquely identified with SAC and its progress, and also with the welfare of its people. He realized that by demanding high standards of readiness, the command exacted a human toll on its people. Being a strong family man, General LeMay had a great concern for his men and their families' welfare, and over the years was responsible for greatly improved living conditions on SAC bases for both married and unmarried personnel.
I think a measure of Curtis LeMay's devotion to his people is how he was concerned about them in their off flying hours. He was an enthusiastic sportsman. He encouraged the development of recreation centers. He developed a particular interest in road racing and road rallies, and that was a feature, really, of the LeMay era. And then he was very concerned about the welfare of his people, particularly his enlisted force, and put a great deal of time and effort into the Cape Cod housing program and developing appropriate housing and recreation facilities for them. He was a genuine total force person.
Under LeMay's leadership and supervision, SAC laid the plans for the development and integration of an intercontinental ballistic missile capability to complement the manned bomber. In July 1957, LeMay became the Vice Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. But even as Vice Chief of Staff, General LeMay continued to set records. In November of 1957, he flew a new Boeing KC-135 jet tanker on 2 record-setting nonstop flights between the United States and Buenos Aires, Argentina, and return. Then, in 1961, LeMay replaced General Thomas D. White and was named the 5th Chief of Staff of the Air Force, a post he held until his retirement in January 1965.
I think historians will forever debate which of the 2 major events in LeMay's career was the more significant. In a combat sense, I think his decision to restructure and redirect the B-29 raids against Japan to adopt a low-level, night bombing, incendiary bombing approach, which of course radically transformed the success of the B-29 campaign. And then the second case is in the post-World War II era, where he radically transformed SAC. He took a look at Strategic Air Command, did not like what he saw in the post-World War II era, saw an organization that he felt had morale problems, had mission problems, had lost its edge, and he determined to build that force into the premier power projection force for the United States, and indeed he did so.
As Chief of Staff, General LeMay remained committed to the welfare and professionalism of the men and women of the Air Force.
He was a happy blend of a guy who didn't have to be a martinet to get absolute loyalty from those who served under him, which is the ultimate accolade of a military commander, or of any kind of commander for that matter. He gets pretty high marks as a human being. You know, he was a cigar-chomping, rough, tough, gruff Kurt LeMay. And over the years, this mystique grew up about him as if he were some sort of ogre, with a crushed cap squared over his eyes and thunderbolting everyone around him. Well, not really. The beauty of him was that he had that effect in terms of what he got out of his troops, but he didn't actually hurl the thunderbolts. It's kind of a strange sort of thing. He got the kind of loyalty that a guy, you would expect a commander to get if he'd intimidated his troops, but he never did intimidate them.
He also remained the chief advocate of the policy for the continued mix of strategic manned bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles as the nation's primary deterrent to nuclear attack, when the administration pressed for a change in that policy. After his retirement, he continued to be a strong supporter of the Air Force and the welfare of its people.
Being born in 1906, right after the airplane first flew, my history is the history of the airplane. And you know as well as I do that any way you measure it, speed, performance of any kind, the curve for the air art is going just like that. And what's going to happen in the future is going to happen so rapidly that if you don't keep abreast, you're really lost.
His concern over declines in national defense capabilities and the ongoing war in Vietnam prompted the general to join George Wallace as his vice presidential running mate in the 1972 presidential race. In 1987, the General and Mrs. Curtis E. LeMay Foundation was set up by the general and his wife to provide assistance to indigent widows of retired Air Force officers and enlisted retirees. General LeMay died in 1990, but his legacy lives on. He changed forever the way nations use bombers as an offensive weapon during war and as a source of deterrence against attack during times of peace. His creation of the Strategic Air Command as a deterrent to nuclear attack during the Cold War helped defeat the Soviet Union and brought peace and an end to the threat of nuclear annihilation. Although he is remembered for his tough, war-winning leadership, his legacy is one of peace. And for that, he is a true legend of air power.
The minuscule island, spanning less than a single square mile, claimed over 4,000 lives. Tarawa epitomizes the intense combat witnessed during the war, with American forces relentlessly pushing the Japanese back, one island at a time, across the Pacific. In February 1942, Japanese bombers launched an attack on the Australian mainland. This assault temporarily incapacitated the naval base in Darwin. As the Japanese advanced across New Guinea, some Australians feared it was the precursor to an invasion. However, discord between the Japanese Army and Navy halted their invasion plans, leaving them in abeyance. In reality, the Japanese found themselves stretched too thin. Amid the harsh conditions of the New Guinea jungle, Australian forces, bolstered by increasing American support, repelled the Japanese incursion toward the crucial base of Port Moresby. Along the Kokoda Trail, the Allies launched a counter-offensive. Disease and illness proved as formidable as enemy bullets. By the close of 1942, the threat to Australia had been neutralized, setting the stage for the protracted and bitter struggle to push the Japanese forces back to their homeland. The Allied offensive was divided between two rivals, General Douglas MacArthur in the Southwest Pacific and Admiral Chester Nimitz in the Central Pacific. The American strategy aimed at launching a dual assault against an enemy whose control spanned vast expanses of land and ocean. MacArthur's objective was to advance northward from the Solomons and New Guinea towards the Philippines. Meanwhile, Nimitz's forces were tasked with a series of strategic island-hopping maneuvers, beginning with the Gilberts in November 1943 at Tarawa, then progressing to the Marshall Islands, the Marianas, Iwo Jima, and finally Okinawa. The initial target of Admiral Nimitz's island-hopping campaign was Tarawa Atoll, which had been fortified by the Japanese into a stronghold from which they could launch air attacks on US fleets. Taking Tarawa was imperative. It marked the first amphibious assault on a heavily fortified atoll shielded by a coral reef. Initially, none of the 5,000 Marines in the assault force comprehended the full extent of Tarawa's defenses.
They thought they would level the island and completely demolish everything, that there wouldn't be a living soul on the island.
I remember him telling us this is going to be the easiest invasion we ever had. He says we only need 2 men, one with a rifle and one with a slate, one to shoot him, one to chalk him up. It's going to be real easy.
I turned to the major who was standing next to me on the deck and said, some of our people aren't aiming very well today. He said, you don't think those are our shells, do you? I realized then for the first time they were being shot at, and there were indeed some Japanese on Tarawa.
Everyone was confident that you could kick hell out of the Japanese. The Marines would have no problem with them if we could get our feet on the beach.
You must remember that the island was only 800 or 900 yards wide, and when you put 20,000 men on an island like that, it's quite crowded.
We were told that perhaps that we could take this island within a very short time, and it was quite evident within hours of our landing that this would not be so.
The foxholes that had been covered up with the naval gunfire, the next morning, within about 20 yards of where I was, I watched the Japanese digging out. They were digging the sand out of the place so that they could see out.
The battle persisted for 3 grueling days, gradually pushing the Japanese defenders back to one end of the diminutive island. The Japanese commander had arrogantly proclaimed that Tarawa could not be captured for a century.
If you can imagine the effect, nearly 6,000 dead men on an island this small, and considering that it's 1 degree from the equator, the amount of heat you have there, you can imagine the smell that you get within a day or 2 from all this rotting flesh. It was a sort of a sweet smell, sickly sweet, described it. And I don't know anywhere in World War II where there was such a concentration of death.
The outcome was stark. Out of 3,000 Japanese defenders, only 17 surrendered. The Americans suffered heavy losses, with over 1,000 dead and 2,000 wounded. Public opinion in the United States was deeply shaken by the significant casualties incurred in such a brief span of combat. Following the Tarawa campaign, American invasion forces set their sights on the Mariana Islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. Positioned west of Saipan, the Naval Task Force safeguarded the landings. In June 1944, Japan's mobile fleet from Okinawa approached, seeking a naval victory to shift the tide of the war in their favor. Suddenly, the Americans realized they'd been detected by the Japanese via radar. Every available American fighter was scrambled into the air to intercept successive waves of Japanese carrier-based planes. Many Japanese pilots were competitive novices with no battle experience. Their aircraft were poorly armored. For the American pilots, engaging their adversaries felt as effortless as shooting turkeys. Following the initial skirmish, all but one of the American planes returned unscathed. Rearmed and refueled, the Americans stood prepared for the next Japanese offensive. Despite two subsequent onslaughts, the Americans held a significant advantage with nearly 900 carrier-based planes, double the size of the Japanese fleet. The Marianas aerial engagement lasted a mere 8 hours, resulting in the near decimation of Japanese naval airpower in a single day. The initial fleet of 430 planes was reduced to approximately 100. American losses remained comparatively minimal. This episode underscored the paramount importance of skilled pilots over sheer technological prowess. As dusk settled, the Americans emerged victorious in the aerial conflict, yet the whereabouts of the retreating Japanese fleet remained unknown. The following day, the American search for the enemy persisted. It wasn't until late afternoon that their aircraft finally spotted the mobile fleet, positioned over 200 miles away at the outer reaches of the American bomber's range. Despite the fading light, the order to attack was issued. In the ensuing engagement, the primary target of the American assault, the Japanese carrier force, suffered significant damage. One carrier was sunk and 2 others were left battered. This pivotal naval encounter, marked by a notable absence of direct fleet-to-fleet combat, concluded with the Japanese fleet reduced to a mere 35 aircraft as they retreated to their bases in Japan. But now, the American planes faced the challenge of returning to the carrier. The decision to engage in combat meant risking the possibility of running out of fuel during the journey home. The first to return were the fighters, which had provided protection for the task force. Landing in the dusk posed significant challenges, but the difficulty escalated as torpedo planes and bombers navigated to find their carriers in pitch darkness, with some never making it back.
Then it turned into probably the blackest night that I have ever seen in my life. And over the ocean, I guess we were at about 7,000 feet flying home. It's kind of our best altitude for fuel, and it was black as the ace of spades. And we could hear nothing, just ourselves, except the cries, or I won't say cry, but a very perfunctory call, I'm going to have to land in the water, I'm out of fuel. And this continued just constantly until all the torpedo planes that had survived the strike went into the water. And then I suppose about 100 miles from the force, the dive bombers started to run out of fuel, and they called out, this is whatever the call was, I don't really remember the number, I'm going in, out of fuel. And then it became quite quiet until we got within range of the force, and then you could start to make out what was happening at the task force and what the recovery course would be. We'd not yet seen it because the ships were running blacked out, which is a normal operating procedure, so it couldn't be detected from the air. But the Admiral knew that we were going to have an awful problem getting aboard, and they were low on fuel, and we didn't have time to really look for the force. A decision was made, and the command was given out to the carriers to turn their lights on.
The subsequent day saw the task force successfully rescuing the majority of aircrews who had been forced to ditch in the ocean. The triumph in the Battle of the Philippine Sea ensured that the Mariana landings could proceed without interference from the Japanese Navy. Saipan fell at a heavy cost of 3,000 American lives. Tinian, though less fortified, also succumbed. Guam, however, managed to hold out for 3 weeks. As the American forces advanced westward from the Marianas, Nimitz transferred an amphibious force under MacArthur's command, marking a convergence of the two rival prongs. Their joint objective became the Palau group of islands. These had been taken before the invasion of the Philippines. On one island, Peleliu, the Americans again run into nautical resistance from a crack force of 10,000 Japanese troops. Rather than confronting the Americans on the beaches, the Japanese had retreated into an intricate network of caves and tunnels. The Americans found themselves locked in a grueling struggle for every inch of ground against a resolute enemy prepared to fight to the last. The brutal battle for Peleliu exacted a heavy toll, with 4 out of every 10 American participants killed or wounded.
This was no campaign like Peleliu. Much has been written about it in the higher echelons, among generals, and so forth, comparing it to Iwo Jima or Tarawa, and they all admit that there was nothing quite like Peleliu. It was the biggest surprise I think the Marine Corps received in World War II. We just had never known an enemy like this.
It took months before all of the Japanese defenders were rooted out. Victory on these Pacific islands came at a steep price. On October 20th, 1944, MacArthur fulfilled his pledge by returning to the Philippines. The landings encountered minimal resistance. The Japanese had retired inland to their main defences, but the invasion touched off the largest and most complex naval battle in history. The battle for Leyte Gulf stretched across 4 days, with 4 Japanese forces converging on the Philippines from Borneo, Formosa and mainland Japan. The Americans, commanding the 7th and 3rd Fleets, aimed to thwart the Japanese objective of annihilating the American invasion shipping in Leyte Gulf. Following a series of disjointed engagements occurring hundreds of miles apart, the Imperial Japanese Navy suffered substantial losses, rendering it ineffective as a fighting force. Meanwhile, relentless rainfall impeded the progress of MacArthur's troops, facing off against a Japanese army numbering nearly 400,000. By February 1945, just 3 months after the late landings, American forces were encroaching upon the Philippine capital, Manila. It marked the first instance in the Pacific War where Americans engaged in urban warfare, with battles raging from street to street and house to house. Many civilians lost their lives, some executed by the retreating Japanese. MacArthur's triumphant return to the Philippines capital marked a pivotal moment. American prisoners, held captive during the Japanese invasion, were finally liberated after enduring 3 years of captivity. With the American recapture of the Philippines, vital supply routes crucial for Japanese industry would be severed. The Japanese leadership understood that losing control of the Philippines meant losing the war. Following liberation came a period of reckoning, as individuals sought revenge against Filipinos accused of collaboration during the years of Japanese occupation, bringing closure to a tumultuous chapter. In February 1945, the focus shifted to Iwo Jima, an 8-square-mile expanse of volcanic rock located just 600 miles from the Japanese coast, representing the next strategic leap across the Central Pacific. From Iwo Jima, American bombers gained strategic proximity, enabling raids on Japanese cities with unprecedented ease. Perched atop Mount Suribachi's commanding heights, the Japanese maintained a vigilant watch over every movement on Iwo Jima. Once again, the bulk of Japanese forces were positioned inland, away from the shoreline. Over a span of 76 days preceding the landing, the Americans subjected Iwo Jima to relentless bombardment from both sea and air.
The waste, the barrenness of the place, it was actually like a nightmare. It was the closest thing you could see to hell. If ever hell looked like anything, it must look like Iwo Jima.
The minute you got in those boats, you were scared, and you were scared until you hit the beach.
You realize that you're going in to kill, and we were always taught that we had to kill or be killed. It was either us or the Japanese, one or the other. And when you're faced with this situation, as a young man, I was only 19, it's confusing. You built in the Marine Corps to take orders and to obey orders, but at the same token, you're still a human being, and you're only 19 or 20. Most of us were only 18, 19, or 20 during those days. I think the public has the idea that Marine are supermen, but I don't think there was a Marine in the amphibious landing craft that wasn't afraid, including the officers. I was always taught to hate them in the Marine Corps, to detest them, and that they were animals, that we were the men, they were the animals. By the same token, we were taught that they would die for the emperor, that we weren't taught to die for our president. And to fight or to come up against an individual who wants to die or who doesn't care about dying is a tough thing to combat in your mind. We wanted to live, we wanted to kill him, and we wanted to survive.
You have to keep your head down because there's too much fire above you. And it's that constant wondering, is somebody going to drop a lucky one in there and you're too far out to swim with all that gear on? And what are you going to get into when you get there? It's a hell of a place to be.
And as you hit the island and you saw the ash and nothing living. It was, if there's ever been hell, this was it. When we hit the beach itself, actually there was a little incline, and everybody clung to the incline because the fire was that heavy. And everything that hit the beach was blasted out of the water as fast as it hit.
I was young then. This is my fourth operation. I was 18. My first operation, I was 16.
They just lay there and waited for us, and rhythmically just kept on tattooing every man along the line. And you just couldn't avoid it. The slaughter was fantastic. We were just walked into a web, and there was no way out. You couldn't get off the beach.
And getting into the beach was a depressing scene. It sort of knocked your morale down when you start to see your own people from your own team dead. There was this, from the water's edge to sort of a rise, there was a tremendous amount of bodies just lying there.
We moved about, possibly 300 yards in, just as far as they meaning the Japanese, decided for us to go.
There was no way of getting off the island. Not that first night. It was just too congested. There was nothing that could move off that island the first night.
Entrenched on the slopes of Mount Suribachi, the Japanese command had concentrated their artillery. Despite the extensive preliminary bombardment, the Japanese strongholds remained resilient, requiring ground troops to systematically dismantle them one by one. Capturing Iwo Jima proved to be a far lengthier endeavour than the 5 days envisioned by the American command.
The entire vegetation was gone completely. And you awaken in the morning and you look out across this particular expanse of no man's land, and it was bubbling and seething with steam coming out of the ground. In fact, we had to use cardboard from sea ration packs to put down in the foxhole so that your ass wouldn't burn up. If there is a hell, I'm living through it now. So I don't have to worry about going to hell anytime in the future. I've been there. One of the guys came up to me. He was a man with a family. I never did even know him. Just, meeting him at that particular day. And I said, well, we're in a mortar outfit back here. Fairly well safe, no problems. Before the day was over, he and half of my other squad was dead.
I think the worst part was you get callous, to dead bodies and bloated bodies, but you never get callous to your own friends in that way. And I think that perhaps was the most terrible thing of Iwo Jima.
I think if everybody remembered all of the tragic things that happened, you would go crazy. You wouldn't be able to survive it.
Oh, you always think you're going to make it. You're scared, but you still think you're going to make it.
It was just one of the biggest messes I myself had ever seen. I don't know who the beach master was, but he probably had the roughest job of any man I've ever heard of.
Although the situation may have appeared chaotic at times, the logistical prowess supporting the assault force underscored America's inevitable victory over Japan, rooted in its overwhelming industrial might since the onset of the Pearl Harbor attacks.
Only one thing seemed to permeate the men. Get that $1 million wound to get off this damn place.
Inland from the beaches, Iwo Jima descended into yet another grueling battle of attrition. With American forces advancing inch by inch against Japanese defenders who chose death over surrender with unwavering resolve. Their leaders still hoped the Americans might tire of their losses and of the war.
My Lord, on Iwo, it was hand-to-hand fighting. You didn't know who was even in the hole with you half of the time.
You went into the caves. We lost most of our people in this particular fashion. You went into the caves and you fought it out with the guy. One of you came out.
I don't think anybody really realized that they were underground so deeply. And it was so heavily defended, really.
After 3 days of fierce combat on Mount Suribachi, the Stars and Stripes triumphantly flew atop the summit.
Boys down at the hollow, there goes the flag. And I don't care where you were on that island, you could see right up to Suribachi, and the flag was raised. And everybody started to howl, because we figured, well, the island was secure, but it was far from secure. We had a long way to go yet, but it was nice to see the flag up there anyway.
They always told you to take prisoners, but we had some bad experiences on Saipan taking prisoners. You take them, and as soon as they get behind the lines, they drop grenades, and you lose a few more people. You're a little bit leery about taking prisoners when they're fighting to the death, and so are you.
Very few of them came out on their own. When they did, well, usually one in the front, he'd come out with his hands up, and one behind him, he'd come out with a grenade.
One of the West Virginia boys, but he was sitting against a stone wall with his knees up under his helmet, as we used to sit quite often, when one of the enemy ran out onto the top of the stone wall and held a small explosive charge to his abdomen, and a chunk of his torso, the lower torso, went spiraling into the air and came down on John's knees, with the absolute posterior, devoid of any clothes, staring him right in the face. And he looked at that and he says, "God, am I hit that bad?" And that was the trigger that released the tensions of the previous night. And there were several of us that were perfectly useless for as much as an hour. We were just laying on the ground in convulsions.
Out of the 21,000 Japanese troops present on Iwo Jima at the onset of the attack, a mere 200 were captured alive.
I was on the island a total of 6 days, and it seemed like 6,000 years.
Remarkably, Iwo Jima's airfields were operational even before the island fell, a testament to the crucial role played by the American construction battalions, known as the CBs, not only on this island, but throughout the entire Pacific theatre of war. With the capture of Iwo Jima accomplished, attention turned to breaching Japan's inner defensive perimeter. Located 350 miles from the mainland, Okinawa stood as the last significant barrier between the Allies and the planned invasion of Imperial Japan. On April 1, 1945, the Americans launched their assault. In defense of Okinawa, Japan's young suicide pilots, the kamikaze, fiercely engaged the Allied forces. Many of these pilots embarked on their fatal missions using outdated aircraft, some even repurposed trainers.
So many things were happening and so quick that it was a little bit like a big boxer in a ring when he's being hit to the chin and to the side of the face and bodies and everywhere else, because we were catching it from so many different angles. In a regular attack, it's a sporting chance you've got, you know. I mean, with regular bombs and regular bullets, you think you've got a very good chance. But war is not so much of a sport when you're fighting human bombs.
Although over 2,000 kamikaze pilots met their demise, their attacks resulted in the destruction of 30 US warships and inflicted damage upon 200 more.
You were praying that you could survive whatever the kind of explosion would come about. Your whole life flashed in front of you very quickly because you didn't know whether it'd be seconds or minutes until your life would be snuffed out.
American casualties were so severe that at one point it seemed the invasion of Okinawa might be stopped in its tracks.
The gunners can't turn it off. Once they gear themselves up to fight man against man bomb, you know, even though the plane is down, and why it's hard for the gunner to stop. One man he was in a 40 millimeter mount, and he had been fighting against quite a number of planes that had come in, but we had been hit in his area also 2 or 3 times, and all of a sudden, with nobody understanding why, he just yelled out, "It's hot today," and jumped over the side, and that's the last we ever saw of him. But had he stayed aboard, he might have survived. But of course, we couldn't find his body or anything after that. But it was an unusual way for a type of reaction. He stayed with it just as long as he could until he broke. And then that was the end of his fighting. But every man, I believe, has a breaking point. And the kamikaze is, I would estimate, is probably tests that breaking point more than any other form of combat.
The initial landings on Okinawa proceeded unopposed, but as the Americans advanced inland, they encountered a formidable Japanese army of 100,000 troops, entrenched in a heavily fortified central position.
The steep hills and narrow ravines of Okinawa formed a natural citadel for the Japanese defenders.
The rugged terrain of steep hills and narrow ravines on Okinawa provided a natural stronghold for the Japanese defenders. However, as Japan itself neared surrender, not every Japanese soldier remained committed to fighting until the bitter end. Meanwhile, the civilians of Okinawa endured devastating losses, with 24,000 killed and many thousands more injured.
Once they found out that we weren't going to do the things that they had always heard, well, they could understand, hey, this is just another human being, and possibly they felt the same as we did, that we weren't there because we wanted to be there. It was we were told that this is what we had to do.
For many Americans, concluding their monumental campaign across the Pacific, It became evident that the perceived faceless fanatics willing to sacrifice themselves for their emperor were, in fact, fellow human beings.
They showed kindness to their own people too, which we didn't really think, that we thought, well, one was just, life was cheap to them, but that's not true. They were, showed a lot of kindness to their own wounded, and would tote them on their back, and 2 or 3 would carry them, although they were weak themselves, so they were people just like us.
This is the consolidated B-36 intercontinental bomber, sometimes referred to as the Peacemaker or the Big Stick. It was the largest conventional warplane ever built. It had tremendous range and a great payload. With its 6 piston engines turning, and later 4 more jets burning, the B-36 for many years projected America's military might.
It was a monstrous airplane. It had 6 engines, and they were pusher props. Now later on they hung jet pods on the ends of the wing, but the early models were all piston engines, pushers. It was a huge airplane, and it was designed then to carry atomic weapons.
But by the mid-50s, its sheer size, cruciform shape, and middling performance worked against it in a world of pure jets. However, in its heyday, the 36 was the very pinnacle of successful giantism. Rather surprising given that a decade and a half earlier, the United States had all but abandoned the idea of operating massive aircraft known as XBLRs, or the Experimental Bomber Long Range. The first attempt, the XBLR-1, resulted in the Boeing XB-15. This was an ambitious and useful experiment that demonstrated the importance of 4-engined bombers. The XB-15 carried a crew of 10. However, its 150-foot wingspan proved too large for practical use. But Boeing's next offering, the XB-17, which followed a year later, perfectly met the needs of the Army. Despite the Army Air Force's decision not to proceed with the XB-15, the political mood in 1938 was undergoing a sea change. With the acquisition of total power by the Nazi Party, American military planners had to contemplate a scenario of German domination of Europe, including Britain. In America in 1938, the question being secretly asked was what if Britain did fall? Perhaps the only way of striking back at the Axis powers in Europe was with the once dismissed experimental bomber Long Range. The XB-LR-2 came together as the XB-19, somewhat bigger than the XB-15, and in fact bigger than any other aircraft in the world at that time. It was to be built by Douglas Aircraft in California. However, by the time the B-19 first flew, the Battle of Britain had already been won, when a few hundred pilots of RAF Fighter Command were just able to halt the Nazi juggernaut. Notwithstanding these events, the B-19 project continued. Some indication of the project's size can be gained from the scope of its planning. The XB-19 required no less than 4 acres of drawings, 500 engineers, and more than 2 million hours of R&D and construction. The 2 massive main towers were 8 foot high, and each was of 24 ply, using 150 miles of rayon cord and 3 miles of steel wire. All of the flying control surfaces were so large that they could only be operated via power-assisted devices. The rudder alone took up an area of 237 square feet of movable surface. To communicate within such a large aircraft, it was necessary to install a 24-set telephone system and a loudspeaker cum fire alarm warning device. And to enable missions of up to 3 days and accommodate at least 13 crew, it was necessary to have a galley, a wardroom, as well as a bunk room. Such were the proportions of what Douglas liked to refer to as their hemispheric defender. In theory, this behemoth flying machine could fly more than 1/3 of the distance around the world without refueling, perhaps reaching parts of Europe and the return trip too. On June 27, 1941, the B-19 made its first flight from Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica to March Air Force Base. Despite various suggestions to the local press at the time, the B-19 was really a proof-of-concept aircraft to explore what could be learnt about building giant aircraft. The B-19 also presented the same problems and lengthy delays as Boeing had endured with its 4-year development of the B-15. Knowing that many of the lessons recently learnt were already becoming obsolete, Douglas suggested that the B-19 be abandoned. However, the Army remained firm that the XBLR-2 would be delivered. In fact, the Douglas Company's view may have been quite sound, as the war had necessitated that the 2 prototype long-range bombers be ordered 6 months before the B-19 ever flew. The Northrop B-35 and its competitor, the enormous consolidated B-36, would use whatever data could be migrated from Douglas. In fact, the B-35's design was a totally different concept, relying upon advanced flying wing aerodynamics to gain maximum range, an idea that was far ahead of its time. Nevertheless, it was the consolidated XB-36 which the Air Force adopted. It was a symbol of pure 1940s giantism, and likely would have benefited from some of the ideas incorporated in the B-19. However, it was a virtual flying gas tank, carrying with it all the fuel it needed for a there-and-back European mission. The Second World War had come and gone before Consolidated's giant reached production, and as Britain did not fall to Germany, the 36's absence had no impact on the conflict, although its presence became critical in the Cold War that followed. It was during this potentially cataclysmic test that America's Peacemaker really came of age. The newly formed Strategic Air Command under General Curtis LeMay would regularly fly to far distant territories just to demonstrate its enormous reach. It was all a very effective show of force, although by the mid-50s, one that was starting to be questioned.
The airplane flew like a glider. It was easy to fly. Anybody could have flown it with 5 hours of stick time. It was a beautiful airplane. It's good that they never had to fly military missions, even with the 4 jet engines which were placed on later.
The success of an earlier Strategic Air Command gamble with the B-47 Stratojet medium bomber demonstrated the need for a faster swept-wing, all-jet-power heavy bomber. Yet Consolidated felt they could still provide a ready answer. The B-60 arrived after a standard 36 fuselage was married to swept wings and tail surfaces. It was propelled by 8 turbojet engines. The concept would have been economical, but advances in in-flight refueling made it no longer necessary for massive fuel loads to be carried. The age of giantism was coming to an end. Strategic Air Command wanted a smaller, faster and more sophisticated heavy bomber, and Boeing's B-52 Superfortress fitted the bill. And in terms of years of service for dollars spent, the B-52 was able to adapt and evolve in a way Convair's Big Stick never could. Still, credit where it's due. The B-36 was for a number of years America's sole intercontinental bomber and served as an effective deterrent, appropriately earning the type its other nickname, the Peacemaker.
It was during the early 1900s, when America was starting to emerge as a world power, that the first Roosevelt made his prophetic statement on international diplomacy. He advised to talk softly, but carry a big stick. Half a century later, when the United States stood as the world's champion against communism, its big stick was undoubtedly the Convair B-36 long-range bomber. Although this mammoth aircraft was to serve throughout the 1950s, it could actually trace its origin back even before America entered the Second World War. 36 was to earn its apt, if unofficial, title of Peacemaker. By 1941, the United States Army Air Force had two effective heavy bombers at its disposal. They were the legendary B-17, designed by the Boeing Company. This superb four-engined aircraft was to serve throughout the war, and the heavily armed later versions were understandably known as the Flying Fortresses. A slightly later model was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The Liberator featured an advanced tricycle undercarriage which permitted higher speed landings, and the design saw service in all theatres of the war. However, the larger, bulkier fuselage enabled some models to be converted into transports, making the B-24 one of the most versatile aircraft in the American inventory. The Liberator, like the 17, was also heavily defended, and it was also able to fly slightly higher than the Fortress. But more importantly, it offered greater range, so it was often used for maritime patrol work, flying what at the time were considered very long distances on internal fuel. However, the B-17 and the B-24 were only able to make the trip from America to Europe one way. In 1941, the Army Air Force also had on order another bomber, ultimately able to fly still higher and further than those preceding it. Another Boeing design, the B-29 Superfortress, was undoubtedly the most powerful bomber to see service throughout the entire conflict. But even though several hundred were on order, there was not even a single prototype in the air. A second backup concept should the B-29 fail in any way was the consolidated B-32 Dominator. This aircraft was not produced in any great numbers, but it did provide a reassuring alternative to the Superfortress's phenomenal capability. However, in 1941, it too could only be seen on the blueprint. By the middle of that year, continental Europe was in Nazi hands as the German juggernaut enjoyed success after success. More importantly, although Britain had regained some supremacy in the air, it still suffered from constant punishing bombardment from the Luftwaffe, which devastated its people and its industry. These raids, often at night, but sometimes in daylight, were seen by the German High Command as a means to bring the island nation to its knees. The burning question which American tacticians struggled with was simply, what would happen if the US was brought into the conflict and the sole remaining Allied base in Europe was to be lost to Germany? One possibility American strategists considered was the development of an aircraft with such phenomenal range that it would actually be able to start from bases on the American East Coast, fly the entire span of the Atlantic to deliver its payload, and then return to continental America without any form of refueling or fighter protection. The American aviation industry had produced long-range bombers in the past. The first of these was an early Boeing project, the XB-15. This aircraft was to have a wingspan of almost 150 feet, but needed all of the power of its four 1,000 horsepower engines to lift its 35 tons of bulk into the air. The second experimental long-range bomber was developed by the Douglas Company. The information gained from the XB-15 and 19 projects, knowledge of the inadequacies of the aircraft inventory in the early 1940s, and the looming prospect of having to wage a European war from American shores, the American Defense Department contemplated the problems of producing an extra long-range heavy bomber to do the round trip across the Atlantic. To do this, it called upon designs from Northrop and Consolidated. The Northrop design was nothing if not unique. The concept worked on the premise that if an aircraft could be produced without the drag effect of the fuselage and tailplane, considerable range would be achieved. Therefore, Northrop set about designing an aircraft which by any other name was just a wing, a flying wing. And on the 25th of October 1941, an order was placed for two XB-35 experimental bombers. The Consolidated design was more conventional than its competitor in shape, but certainly not in size. With an overall wing area of just under 5,000 square feet, the V-36 was to require no less than 6 engines placed at the back of the wing to push its massive 163-foot fuselage through the air. And on the 25th of November 1941, an order was approved for 2 aircraft in the hope that the first would be developed by mid-1944 at a fixed fee of approximately $800,000 each. As it happened, the much-needed bomber bases in Britain were never denied to the Army Air Force, and as a result, the standard B-17 and B-24 heavy bombers were able to attack Axis targets from 1942 onwards. Delivered in their thousands, the Fortresses and Liberators were to wrench a terrible price from the enemy. The longer distances required by the Pacific Theater were amply met by Boeing's B-29. Especially after the capture of the Mariana Islands in mid-1944, which gave the Superfortress the stepping stone which enabled the Air Force to reach the heart of Japan. But it was one particular B-29 with one particular bomb that was to bring the Second World War and much military aircraft development to an end. 2 exceptions to this were experimental long-range bombers ordered only weeks before American involvement in the conflict, but never given sufficient priority until the war's end, and need to deliver a new weapon, never perceived in a tactician's wildest dreams 4 years earlier. The first Northrop B-35 was actually constructed in the open and completed in June 1946. This clever design, which was the source of controversy for many years, was powered by 4 pusher engines and was intended to carry a crew of 9 in the pressurized center section, for its shape barely allowed the word fuselage to be applied. However, the radical new shape, which relied upon flaperons on the end of each wing in lieu of a conventional tailplane, was never to completely overcome stability shortcomings. But the flying wing must surely go down in history as one of the most brilliant aviation concepts ever conceived. The first XB-36 was wheeled out of the experimental hangar just 6 days after Japan surrendered, but it was to be August 1946, nearly 5 years after it was ordered, before the Peacemaker was to be ready to fly. The prototype's single main wheels were 100 inches in diameter and the largest ever made for an aircraft, but this was to prove a major weakness. The 6 pusher-type engines were to have their air intakes on the forward section of the wings. However, this advanced concept for the time was also to provide initial difficulties in cooling the engines and would require later modification. On August the 8th, 1946, the first XB-36 under the command of Captain Beryl A. Erickson rolled down the Fort Worth runway with a total crew of 9 and 8,000 gallons of fuel. At exactly 10 minutes past 1 in the morning, he lifted Convair's giant aerial masterpiece into the air for the first time. It was the biggest plane ever to fly, even in Texas. The flight was to continue for no more than 37 minutes, during which time the undercarriage was to remain in the wheels-down position as a safety precaution. Erickson's crew on this and many subsequent occasions were to put the giant aircraft through many vigorous tasks which quickly identified the problems of giantism, one of the most formidable being the vibration caused by such enormous engines spaced out over the wide distances of the wing, and cooling was another problem, especially at high altitude. It was obvious that there would be many areas requiring major attention. But perhaps the most fundamental was the simple concept of the massive wheel arrangement which limited Convair's bomber to runways at least 22 inches thick, and as there were only 3 of these available anywhere in America, clearly an answer needed to be found, and found quickly. The answer came in what was considered another breakthrough, by combining 4 56-inch wheels into a group under each wing, thus spreading the B-36's phenomenal weight over the much wider area, thereby permitting the Peacemaker to use runways of half the previously required thickness. Very early in the B-36 concept, Convair could see the potential of utilizing its enormous wings and tailplane for the transport version of the Peacemaker's commercial cousin, the XC-99, which was ready for its maiden flight in November 1947. Still larger again than its bomber counterpart, the 99 was assembled at Convair's San Diego operation, but with wings and other common parts shipped across the nation from Fort Worth. Here at Lindenberg Field, what had now become the world's largest plane was to demonstrate the potential that would lead to the mammoth transport and airline concepts that followed decades later. The 99 was to attract considerable attention by Pan Am, who seriously considered a civil version for the west coast of Hawaii run, and actually took out options on 3 such aircraft, but as predicted, The early post-war airline boom was not to transpire for many years. The XC-99 was never to see civil service, and the sole example produced remained in active service with the Air Force until 1957, and became particularly invaluable during the Korean War, when it was used to rush essential payloads from one side of the nation to the other. This aircraft too had to be modified with a new undercarriage system, but when it was, it proved extremely versatile and had, if required, the potential to lift 400 fully equipped troops. Yet, practically, it was just too soon for its time. However, Convair's main interest had always been with the extra long-range bomber concept, and it continued to develop and refine the B-36 throughout the late 40s, emphasizing that this weapon alone provided the ultra-long range to strike virtually any target in the world and return to its base in America. Long range would require many hours of physical endurance for the crew, and therefore inside the 36's massive fuselage, adequate provision was made for sleeping quarters and a galley complete with a 2-burner stove. Ample provisions were always provided. However, the center pressurized section which held these amenities was actually no less than 80 feet from the forward control area, which was only accessible via a narrow tunnel spanning the distance. Heated food was packed in specially designed containers for conveying between the vast distances of the two pressurized sections. The tunnel also served as the only means to convey personnel from one crew section to another, and because of the distances involved, a small trolley was provided to enable each member to propel himself more effectively. Problems generated by the size of the 36 also required other unique procedures never previously required by other aircraft. Immediately after takeoff and before the plane was pressurized, a crew member was given the responsibility of examining certain vulnerable areas within the massive interior structure which formed the fuselage of the 36. Only then would the plane be allowed to climb to higher altitudes and continue with its mission. Other problems in dealing with the size of a 36 came to light. There was the question of how to service each of the massive aircraft, which was so big that special outdoor hangars had to be constructed so that only the essential parts could be accessible. And although the problems of engine vibration and cooling had been successfully resolved, there is no doubt that there were grave concerns with the viability of the B-36 in competition with other alternatives. Firstly, the project's original competitor, the Flying Wing, had been upgraded to an all-jet aircraft, replacing the 4 propellers with 8 turbojet engines. Northrop hoped to increase the speed and viability of its quite brilliant concept, which utilized unique flaperons, shown here at the end of the wing, to make up for the absence of the conventional tailplane. Another and more conventional competitor of the 36 also came from the past. This was the Boeing B-50. The aircraft was really just a standard Superfortress of Second World War vintage, but with more powerful engines and extended range from the underwing mounted fuel tanks. This range was enhanced yet again by Boeing's successful development of aerial in-flight refueling. Thus the Air Force had available to it a proven airplane combination which could fly the same range as the 36, but without having to address the problems of giantism. By the late 40s, due to these innovations, the future of the B-36 looked very bleak indeed. Its salvation came from two major developments. The first one, poetically enough, was also provided by Consolidated's long-term competitor Boeing. For Boeing developed the successful medium-range bomber entirely powered by jets, but utilizing captured German technology which showed the benefits of a swept back wing. Boeing's B-47 was to have the wing that was not only swept, but was so flexible that it could move within an arc of 17 feet. However, so that the wing could remain thin, the 6 engines had to be mounted in pods suspended from below. The outer pods contained 1 engine apiece, but the inboard pods contained 2 engines which were suspended several feet below the wing surface, and it was with this equipment that the engineers from both companies worked together to attach to the far outside wing of Boeing's Giant. With 6 turning and 4 burning, the 36 was at last, in part, entering into the jet age. The other event which was to secure the future of the 36 took place on June the 24th, 1948, when the Soviets closed the gate on Berlin, signaling in one step the beginning of the Cold War. Now, the growing concerns of communism polarized into an action which shocked the West out of its post-war complacency. As NATO forces now found they were confronted with a potent adversary, in a matter of days the need for an intercontinental bomber had gone from hypothetical to the very real. At this stage, there was no one plane in the world able to fulfill the long-range potential of the Convair Giant, and rather than cancellation, orders for the Peacemaker were actually increased. As concern continued, the importance of America's Strategic Air Command, which was responsible for long-range bombing, increased considerably, and it was ultimately placed under the direct command of General Curtis LeMay. LeMay had an impeccable Second World War record. It started with his early involvement in the European bombardment with the Army Air Force, continued to when he took command of the Pacific operations and the B-29 bombardment of Japan. Considered one of the great strategists in American wartime experience, he also supervised the Berlin airlift and was now seen as the most qualified person to bring the Strategic Air Command, including its fast-growing fleet of 36s, to the highest possible state of readiness. Under LeMay's iron leadership of SAC, the American public took comfort in the fact that, although they now no longer had a monopoly on atomic weaponry, that at least they had what was probably the best platform for delivery, the B-36. So concerned was the military about protecting its intercontinental bomber that security was stepped up to effectively a wartime footing, and personnel in SAC control rooms were required to carry firearms, even though they were in fact hundreds of miles inside American borders. The concern to protect America's big stick even required mechanics servicing the engines to carry firearms whilst they worked.
This is the engineer. Engineer checklist complete. Ready for takeoff. Over. Pilot checklist complete. Ready for takeoff. Roger, give me 100% on the jet. Roger. Jet's coming up. Engineer, give me full power. Full power coming over. Jet's 100%. Safe flight jet okay. Takeoff power is set. Everything stabilized. Engineer ready to take off. Roger. Cardinal Tower, Air Force 653, ready for takeoff. Air Force 653, Cardinal Tower, Roger, 30 roll. Roger, 653, rolling. Here we go. Engineer, give me climb power. Roger. Climb power coming on. Give me 96% on the jet. Roger, 96% on the jet.
Usually flying as single aircraft rather than in formation, SAC's Peacemakers would practice bombing raids over vast distances and at next to no notice. The 36s utilized a K-1 bombing navigation system for precision accuracy. The K-1 system contained no less than 365 vacuum tubes and enabled the 36 to bomb at high speed in any weather.
Pilot, go ahead. Pilot will be over the 5 point and 20 minutes.
The target was usually a radio signal from special trucks built to gauge the accuracy of SAC's aircraft. Although the fact that B-36s were to cost over $5 million apiece, they, together with the K-1 system and LeMay's insistence upon constant training, provided a combination which was anything if not accurate.
Pilot, this is radar. We're over the IP. We got the heading of 197. Mount White Airport 653. Over the IP. Altitude 35,000. On an inbound heading of 197 degrees. Mount White Airport 653. 30 seconds to go. The bomb's away. 15 seconds to go, bomb flight. Full switch coming on.
The pencil in the plotter's hand represents the plane moving over the graph scale towards the target.
Bombs away.
However, despite the enormous potential of the conveyor giant, detractors often considered its large size to make it a prime target for enemy fighters, and even before the first 36 even flew, the Air Force ordered a unique auxiliary, the McDonnell Goblin, as a parasite fighter to be actually carried within the B-36. This incredible design consisted of the barest essentials and had fold-dart wings which would enable the aircraft to be totally concealed within the 36's bomb bay. Never actually used with the Peacemaker, its flight controls were conducted from a B-29 mothership, and flight trials commenced in 1948. In August, with test pilot Ed Scorch secured in the cockpit, the Goblin was launched by a trapeze mechanism from the B-29, and the pilot successfully flew what must be one of America's most remarkable fighters. However, when Scorch came to reconnect the Goblin hooked to the trapeze, turbulence lifted the little fighter, and the mother plane mechanism broke the canopy and wrenched the oxygen mask away from the pilot. But Scorch was just able to regain control and crash land this tiny fighter. This setback did not stop development. Second and only other Goblin produced continued its task. Eventually, on October the 14th, 1948, a successful hookup was effected, and the Goblin pulled into the 29's belly. But this bomber-parasite fighter combination, although bold in concept, was never to be adopted because it seemed to present as many problems as it tried to solve. However, a later parasite project involving the B-36 was the Thicon fighter conveyor concept. This program began in 1952 and involved mating up a Republic F-84 directly underneath a modified Peacemaker. There was no intention of fully consuming the F-84 within the mothercraft. Not until after the aircraft and its parasite were in the air would the fighter pilot enter into its cockpit, and he, working as a team with the highly trained boom operator, who was positioned in the mother plane, would attempt the delicate and skillful task of lowering the fighter via a large hydraulic-operated boom to a point below the bomber where the fighter could be successfully released. This task actually proved very successful, and the process of recoupling, although requiring great skill, was perfected to a fine art. The combination of these aircraft provided many potentials, especially as the pilot was able to come and go from the fighter when it was in the docked position. In actual fact, the Falcon mission was really conceived more to extend the reconnaissance capacity of the B-36. The F-84, either in its straight or swept wing form, was an extremely versatile aircraft. And although SAC employed it as its own fighter aircraft, there is no doubt that it could perform the role of an effective fighter bomber, as it demonstrated so capably over Korea. That SAC could now carry such versatile aircraft thousands of miles to the very edge of enemy territory, and small compact nuclear weapons were under development at the same time, it seems probable that SAC could have used its Falcon combination in the bomber role. By the middle 50s, the B-36 was fully developed and deployed at various SAC bases around the nation. By the early 50s, SAC's Peacemakers were at the peak of their development, with the early engine and vibration problems resolved. With the support of jet power and modifications such as a new quick-action bomb bay door, the B-36 personified the ultimate intercontinental atomic bomber of the era. But despite the technical success of the project, it still was to continually suffer from political and inter-service criticism. And even as early as 1949, there had been an investigation into the political influences relating to the 36, all of which came to nothing. But the Navy's resentment of the Peacemaker was stronger and probably more founded. Its promised 65,000-ton supercarrier was to have the capacity to deliver atomic attacks on would-be Soviet industrial centers, and was cancelled, partly because of the Air Force insistence that the 36 deterrent was far more flexible and did not represent the eggs-in-one-basket philosophy of a carrier. What was equally important was that SAC claimed it was just as able to operate from the edge of enemy territory and in conditions that would have been impossible for naval aviation. To demonstrate their point, B-36s were to regularly fly from their home bases in central USA to the very edge of Soviet territory. Highly trained crews of pilots, navigators, radio operators, engineers, and gunners would prepare for long hours of flight, often at very high altitudes, over thousands of miles to the frozen wastelands of Alaska. These men would know that once into the Arctic region, should their aircraft fail and crash land, and some did, there was very little chance of survival in the sub-zero and uninhabited wilderness. Against these prospects, the roar of the Peacemaker's 6-piston and 4-jet engines must have sounded far more a blessing than a curse. The Navy's criticism of the Peacemaker still continued. One time they actually made a formal request to the Air Force for the use of a 36 to test its defensive capability against Navy fighters. Outwardly it displayed very little defensive armament, but covered under sliding panels, the Peacemaker concealed 6 remotely controlled turrets, each with 2 20mm cannons. These turrets could be hydraulically raised as required, and when used in conjunction with the forward nose turret and radar-controlled rear turret, combined to offer no less than 16 cannons, covering every approach for a range of over half a mile, making the Peacemaker the most heavily defended aircraft in aviation history. Ellison Air Force Base in Alaska was a point to which many B-36s on exercise would travel. Here, Peacemaker's captains would land their massive aircraft, never knowing beforehand just what weather conditions would prevail as they made their approach. For some, the function would be little different than that at Offutt, thousands of miles away. But with the weather constantly changing, for others following close behind, visibility would be close to zero, testing the pilot's skill and resolve to the limit. Once down, each aircraft would be quickly guided away to its service area, and waiting heated buses would be quickly on hand to collect the tired and weary crew, who, despite the winter protection, would doubtless be noticing the contrast from what might have been Texas to Alaska non-stop. So cold was the region that if aircraft had been standing for anything more than a short time, the engine would require supplementary heating, mainly through the giant air intakes, to ensure the equipment was not frozen solid. To achieve this, large mobile heating plants were developed which could pipe vast amounts of hot air into and around all the piston engines. The crew compartment was also given the same treatment, not merely to make the area habitable, but because the instrumentation and on-board equipment simply would not work effectively in such a cold environment. Refueled and ready to go, 36s would again brave the cold Arctic sky on the way back south, leaving the area to its natural inhabitants. But the real purpose of these exercises was to demonstrate that from Alaskan bases it would be just as easy to turn northwest to Soviet territory and deliver the devastating cargo around which the 36 was developed. Cargo of another sort was identified. Convair, which designed the 36, won the contract for the Air Force's first supersonic bomber, the B-58 Hustler, which was the culmination of Convair's long involvement with the Delta design. It was found that moving from base to base, an as yet unflown bomber, was not an easy task, until it was temporarily mounted under a standard 36 with its 2 inboard props removed to protect the Hustler wingtips. Perhaps this image symbolizes beyond all else the difference between the two generations of aircraft. In the space of less than 10 years, quest to improve the speed of bomber aircraft had so radically changed the shape and size that tomorrow's medium bomber was able to fit comfortably under yesterday's heavy bomber. Clearly, the age of giantism was coming to a close, and yet Convair still held hopes for its mammoth in an upgraded form. The company produced the YB-60 in response to the Air Force requirement for an all-jet heavy bomber. Hopes were high at Fort Worth in April 1952 when the 60 made its first public debut. The continuation of the production line would guarantee the jobs of thousands of staff involved and subcontractors. It would have brought added prosperity to the city, which had produced the world's biggest bomber. The YB-60 was virtually a B-36 with new, fully swept wings and tailplane. Having no defensive armament other than the rear turret, the entire rear crew and quarters were omitted. Added power and less weight brought the YB-60 to a top speed of just over 500 miles per hour, and its production was achieved in rapid time, as 70% of its components were standard to the 36. Two such examples were ordered by the Air Force to test the concept, but only one was to actually fly. The apparent enthusiasm of the test crew was not shared by the Air Force. They preferred Boeing's all-new design B-52, the Superfortress, which, although more expensive, offered better performance in range and speed, shown here next to the original Boeing heavy bomber. On August 14, 1954, at a ceremony at Convair's production line in Fort Worth, the last B-36 was handed over to the Air Force. Final delivery from the Peacemaker plant must have been a bittersweet affair for the Fort Worth people, because although Convair was to continue to use the plant for many successful projects, it was from this base that they had produced what was for many years the biggest plane ever to fly, and a plane, many would say, because of its sheer size, won a war without having to fight.
He was supposed to be a doctor, but fell in love with flight as a young boy and never gave up his dream of flying. He proved himself in the war over Europe and demonstrated in a series of bold missions that he could not only fly, but lead. He played an instrumental role in the development and deployment of the B-29 Flying Fortress, and every pilot who flew that plane flew it the way he taught them. And when the Manhattan Project bore its terrible fruit, the job of ending World War II fell to him. He planned the mission, set up the training and logistics to support it, and when the president gave the order, he flew the plane that ushered in the atomic age.
To think of Paul Tibbets as just the commander of the aircraft that dropped the first atomic weapon is to do the man a little bit of a disservice. It was truly a defining moment in the world history. But Tibbets himself had been an outstanding pilot.
He is General Paul Tibbets. Paul Tibbets was born in Quincy, Illinois on February 23, 1915. His father, a strict disciplinarian, served in World War I and never recovered from the death and destruction he witnessed there. After the war, he moved his family to Florida and got a job as far away from the military as he could, selling candy for the Curtis Candy Company.
When we got old enough to know what I was talking about, why, my father told me I was going to become a doctor. Having learned earlier not to disagree with him as openly, I believed him. I believed him until I got my first airplane ride at the age of about 12.
Tibbets' first flight was over the Hialeah racetrack in Miami. He flew in a biplane and helped the pilot throw candy bars down on the crowd as promotion. His father, down on the ground, disapproved of his son's obvious love of flight.
I knew that I was going to have to be a pilot. I didn't tell my dad, because didn't have nerve enough at age 12 to say anything.
Tibbets' family sent him to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, where he played football with future fighter ace Butch O'Hare. Tibbets went on to the University of Florida. Florida lacked a medical school at the time, so Tibbets transferred to the University of Cincinnati. During the summers back in Florida, he snuck off to sunny South Airfield for flying lessons. Without telling his parents, he enlisted in the Army and drove from Cincinnati to Wright Field in Dayton for a flight physical. A few weeks later, he was sworn in as a flight cadet and ordered to San Antonio for training. He took a train to Florida, dreading the conversation with his father.
Finally, I got my nerve right up to peak, and I looked at him and I said, I want to tell you, I'm leaving college. I'm going to go down to flying school at San Antonio, Texas, learn to be a pilot in the Army Air Corps. He looked at me, he said, you know, I've been supporting you ever since you've been little, and I've been sending you through school. But since you're leaving school, you're on your own from here on. And go kill yourself. I don't give a damn.
Tibbets' mother was more understanding and encouraged him to follow his dream. But Tibbets' relationship with his father was changed forever. And as he reported to San Antonio, he felt as if one life had ended and a new life was beginning. Tibbets earned his wings in 1938. Clearly the outstanding pilot in his class, he surprised everyone by choosing multi-engine aircraft instead of fighters. He believed he would have more independence flying reconnaissance and spent the next 2 years logging hundreds of hours in ungainly observation craft. In 1941, he became Group Engineering Officer of the 3rd Attack Group. He trained in the A-20, the Army Air Force's new low-level attack bomber. Reassigned in early December to fly B-18s on anti-submarine patrol, Tibbets was on his way to his new base when he heard of the attack on Pearl Harbor. The entry of the United States into the war, of course, changed everything. The Army Air Force changed Tibbets' assignment to B-17s. The training pace was frantic as Tibbets and the other flyers struggled to learn the almost entirely new art of strategic bombing. For 6 months, they flew hour after hour to targets hundreds of miles away, practicing for the battles to come. After 6 months of dry runs and pretend bombing, with the United States newly at war and completely unprepared for what would follow, Tibbets and the 97th Bomb Group got their overseas orders. In the summer of '42, Tibbets took off from Bangor, Maine, to fly the Great Circle route to England. There he knew the war awaited him. When Captain Paul Tibbets arrived in Europe, England seethed with war. The Battle of Britain had been fought and won. The RAF controlled the skies over England, and the threat of a German invasion no longer loomed large. Still, the survival of Great Britain remained in enough doubt that the English exported most of their scientific research to the safer shores of North America. Among those who left were scientists working on advanced radar, and a small group of German expatriates who were gradually unraveling the secrets of the atom. Thousands of Americans flooded the countryside, taking up residence in hastily constructed air bases at the ends of mud roads. The skies were filled with bombers and fighters, an air force unlike any ever assembled, with a single mission: hit Germany, and hit it hard. Though just one of hundreds of young captains, Tibbets stood out. He and his crew seemed more ready for war than the other crews, and for that reason, the Army Air Force chose him to lead the first American daylight attack against German-occupied Europe. While nominally under the command of General Ira Aker, Tibbets handled the operational details and execution. On August 17, 1942, 18 B-17s took off from England to bomb a train yard near the French city of Rouen. The mission went off without a hitch, and all 18 planes returned home safely. In late 1942, the European Command tapped Tibbets to fly General Mark Clark on a secret mission from England to Gibraltar. Clark was laying the groundwork for Operation Torch, the American invasion of North Africa. Clark's mission was to meet with Admiral Darlan, the commander of the French colony of Algeria, to find out if the French Navy in Algiers would resist the American invasion. Tibbets flew Clark around occupied Europe, staying low over the Atlantic Ocean the whole time. Clark's negotiations with Darlan went well, and the French admiral agreed not to resist the American invasion. Clark returned, and with a glowing report, not only about Darlan, but also about the young pilot who had executed the dangerous flight with so little apparent trouble. So it was no surprise when a few weeks later, Tibbets got the job of flying Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower and his entourage to Gibraltar to observe the actual invasion.
We're standing there waiting, and it's almost midnight at night because the weatherman from the base had come in. Each time weather was still, marginal for takeoff even. They just said it was dangerous. Last time, we're standing under the airplane, and he comes up, and he looks at General Eisenhower, and he says, "General, I cannot promise you any better weather than this for the next 4 days." He said, "It's terrible, but that's my forecast. We'll have the same thing for 4 days." And Eisenhower looked at Jimmy Doolittle, and he said, "Jimmy, what should we do?" Doolittle looked right back at him and said, "Don't ask me, General. Paul's flying the airplane. He's the man." And with that, I was looking at General Eisenhower. I said, "General Eisenhower, I realize the importance of you and your staff and the people. But if I'd been here alone, I'd have been gone by this time. I wouldn't have been waiting all this time. I'd been gone." And he said, "Let's go. I got a war waiting on me."
Tibbets took off in a pea soup fog. Eisenhower sat on a board propped between seats in the cockpit. Once again, Tibbets flew low to stay out of sight of patrolling German fighters. He covered more than 1,000 miles, only a few feet above the tops of the waves. He got Eisenhower to Gibraltar just as the invasion started, only a few minutes after the first paratroops landed. The ground crew was amazed. Tibbets' plane was encrusted with salt from flying so low over the ocean. Eisenhower told his staff that Captain Tibbets was the best pilot he'd ever flown with.
I had stayed pretty close to the Whitecaps in that. I always talked about that. And Eisenhower later complimented me and, so that sort of thing about what a nice ride he had. And I didn't know until just a year ago, Eisenhower held a private pilot's license. He had earned it as a first lieutenant in the Philippines.
Doolittle apparently agreed with Eisenhower. After letting the captain fly a few more combat missions over North Africa, the general had him transferred to the 12th Air Force, which was trying to adapt to the B-29 Marauder. The Marauder was a nasty airplane, finicky in flight and difficult to control. Tibbets, however, quickly mastered the plane, and seemed adept at helping those around him master the aircraft as well. Halfway around the world in Wichita, Kansas, Boeing was fighting to tame the Air Corps' newest bomber, the B-29 Superfortress. A huge plane capable of carrying a massive bomb load, the B-29 was a strategic planner's dream that had turned into a pilot's nightmare. Since rolling off the assembly line, the B-29 had killed the only crew that knew how to fly it. The Army Air Force needed a pilot who could come in, get a handle on the plane, and in effect save what was at that time the most expensive weapon system in history. In July 1943, Tibbets reported to Boeing in Wichita. A line of B-29s sat parked on a taxiway. They were huge, technologically advanced, and, without crews to fly them, absolutely useless. Tibbets looked around, shook a few hands, and asked an engineer if he knew how to start the plane's engines. When the engineer said he could, Tibbets grabbed a pilot who was walking by and told him they were going flying.
He said, I've never been in one. I don't know how to fly it. I said, don't make a difference. I haven't been in one either, but we're going to fly this airplane. And with that, now, not trying to be funny, but I knew damn well if it flew like an airplane, I could fly it.
Tibbets and his stunned co-pilot taxied back and forth on the runway, getting a feel for the plane. Tibbets tested the brakes and the ailerons, stopping now and then to cool the engines, which were designed for the cold temperatures at high altitude. And then, with a small crowd looking on and wondering if he had lost his mind, he took off. Over the next few days, he and his improvised crew logged 10 hours in the unflyable bomber.
I did do the Phase 5 flight test for the factory and the government because there was nobody to fly that airplane in thunderstorms and things like that. But they wanted to measure stresses and strains, and I got to like the airplane, and I was really happy with it.
After mastering the aircraft and documenting its flight characteristics, Tibbets set up the school that trained every B-29 pilot who fought in the war. It was at that school that Tibbets was first approached about the mission that would etch his name forever in the history books. Walking into the ready room after flying a training mission, a mysterious captain approached him and started asking questions. Tibbets apparently gave the right answers, because after a few minutes, the captain introduced Tibbets to a second, older man.
Young man. And he said, I want to tell you about the Manhattan Project. So he gave me an outline about splitting. First off, he said, do you know anything about atoms? And I said, no.
The massive research effort to design an atom bomb had been going on for years. It was called the Manhattan Project, a code name designed to mislead those who stumbled across its paper trail into thinking it had something to do with sewers in New York City. In fact, it was the most monumental engineering project in history, a crash program to turn the most esoteric area of theoretical science into a working weapon.
They knew that it would do something. They knew, well, yes, it'll drop 100,000 tons of TNT, but what's 100,000 tons of TNT? Or how much, no one knew. No one ever seen that much in one place at one time.
The program was, by almost any measure, an amazing success. And as the first test of a nuclear bomb approached, the last piece of the puzzle became not scientific or technical, but logistical. How to deliver the bomb to the target. Doing that was not going to be easy. There were two designs for an atom bomb, and both were too big to fit in the bomb bays of even a B-29. The explosion itself would be so large that it might incinerate the crew that delivered the weapon. So a new type of mission would have to be designed. All of this would require the assembly and training of a logistics train stretching from the United States to the target. Hundreds of crewmen, mechanics, and other support personnel working in secretive isolation.
I was confident enough. I knew I could do it. I mean, at that time, I had so much confidence that you can't imagine. I'd been successful in everything I'd undertaken. And to put an airplane together to carry a bomb, to get the people to fly them, maintain them, and all that sort of thing, I had no problem with them.
Tibbets' reputation was not only that he was extremely competent, yes, but he was also a wonderful pilot, and he was also a leader of men. He had demonstrated that time and time again, and he had also demonstrated his abilities firsthand to major figures in the United States Army. So they knew who this man was.
Yeah, it's difficult to imagine a person who would have been better qualified or have done it better.
The Army could do little to help Tibbets do his job because no one had ever done what he was charged with doing. He was given a vote of confidence that included a caveat. Do it right, you're a hero. Do it wrong, you may go to jail. Armed only with his own knowledge and a code word, silver plate, that would get him whatever he wanted without question, Tibbets went to work setting up what became the 509th Composite Group.
And General Ed had told me when I left his office, he said, you go by Wendover, Utah, and take a look at it. If you like that place, you can have it. He said, if you don't like that, go to forgotten where field is, South Dakota. And then he gave me one in Kansas. He said, if you like them, you can have them. If you don't like them, we'll hunt for one you will like.
Tibbets liked Wendover just fine. Located on the Utah-Nevada border, it was only a few hours from the Los Alamos nuclear test site, so Tibbets' crew could support the ballistics testing of the prototype bombs. It existed in self-sufficient isolation. No one would go off base for a drink and give away any secrets. Or so Tibbets thought, until he got word from intelligence agents that a couple of his mechanics had been bragging about their secret mission in Salt Lake City. Tibbets hauled them into his office.
You know, you're talking, you're breaking security in wartime. I said, I've got to debate whether I ought to put you in front of a court-martial and have you shot, or whether what I would do. Go back to the barracks and stay there. And you're limited to the barracks and the mess hall. That's the only places you can go. You can't go to the exchange, you can't go anywhere else.
Fortunately, information about what exactly Tibbets was doing was so tightly controlled that even the people working for him had no idea what they were working on.
You had to have a green airplane, a green pass to get on an airplane. You had to have an orange pass to get into the area of the ordnance people. Just to be in the camp that we had, you had to have a white pass. So everybody had three passes if they were going either to the airplanes or the other to the ordnance section. Well, those were very few and far between, obviously.
The 509th formed officially in December 1944 and quickly grew to more than 200 officers and 1,500 men, almost all of them completely mystified about their location, their mission, and the heavy security that surrounded them.
Whoever chose Tibbets chose well. Tibbets is a remarkable leader. You discover this instantly if you talk to the people that he led during World War II. He is a remarkable organizer. He is a leader, an organizer, an airman. He has just many personal qualities that I think just kind of stand out.
Tibbets asked for and got 15 brand new B-29s, stripped of armament and armor, modified with fast-opening bomb bay doors, equipped to carry a single 10,000-pound bomb.
Now, the way I worked it in the States was easy, keeping it flying over the West where there's nothing. But I wanted them to get over water training, and I arranged to get Batista Field in Havana, Cuba, where I could send 3 airplanes at a time down there, let them stay there for a couple of weeks. They flew over water at night, they flew over water in the daytime. They had to use the sun, both all the daylight flights, they had to use the stars on the night flights. And they got very good at what they were doing.
The 509th started moving to the Pacific island of Tinian in the spring of 1945. Tinian was the American air base closest to Japan, and the 509th set up its operations separate from everyone else on the island.
The special training the crews received, it was primarily to increase accuracy, and then they also had to know that they could not use the normal technique for bombing. Normally, you fly straight and level over a target, you drop your weapons, and they fall below the aircraft, and they fall basically under the aircraft until they hit the ground. You cannot do that with an atomic weapon because the blast will come straight up the mushroom clouds we're familiar with. So they had to develop a new technique, and the crews had to be prepared for this, which once the weapon was dropped, the plane would immediately make a sharp turn and dive away so they would be out of the blast range.
Along with his pilots and mechanics, there was a group of nuclear technicians who would assemble the bomb. President Truman was at the Potsdam Conference when he was informed that the first test of a working nuclear device was a success. The explosion, far from population centers in the New Mexico desert, was like nothing the world had ever seen. On the way back from the conference, Truman gave the order to go forward with the atomic bombing of Japan. At 2 o'clock in the morning, August 6, 1945, Tibbets' plane, the Enola Gay, began its long roll down the runway on Tinian. Once in the air, the technicians aboard finished the final assembly of the bomb, which was nicknamed Little Boy. The flight was uneventful. Japanese radar detected the Enola Gay and its escort just after dawn and broadcast an alert. At 8:16, the Enola Gay's bombardier released Little Boy over the center of Hiroshima.
No regrets, whatever. I've never lost a night's sleep. I've never lost 15 minutes sleep. This was war. I didn't carry the war with me. I didn't start the war. I had a job to do during wartime, and nothing personal entered into that. I was going to do what I was told to do.
Tibbets put the plane into a steep dive to gain speed, swung back in the direction he had come from. He pressed the throttles forward, and when the protective goggles he had been instructed to wear kept him from seeing his instruments, he took off. He needed 8 miles between him and the explosion for his crew to survive the shockwave. They made it, barely, and when they got back to Tinian, they were greeted as heroes. 8 days later, the war was over. The flight over Hiroshima was Colonel Paul Tibbets' last combat mission.
This is it. This is the B-29, the plane you've been waiting for. And it was worth waiting for. It's the biggest, fastest, mightiest heavy bomber in the world. It can travel farther and higher than anything else on wings. It has a pressurized cabin, permitting high-altitude flight without oxygen masks. It has 5 remotely controlled, electrically driven turrets, each carrying twin 50s, with a 20mm cannon added to the turret in the tail. Yes, the B-29 is everything you've been promised. And the pilot who flies one has an enviable job. Important, glamorous, and tough. Here's a B-29 pilot. He's measuring the distance between pin centers on the left landing gear. This part of the job isn't so glamorous, but it's the pilot's responsibility to make sure that everything on this biggest bomber in the world works properly. If you were a B-29 pilot, here's exactly what you'd have to do before an operational flight. Check the nose wheel. See that the tires are inflated to 45 to 50 pounds per square inch. While measuring the pressure, look over the tires for general condition also. Watch out especially for cuts or signs of serious wear. One of the ground crew will replace the dust covers, but you're still responsible for his work. After you've measured the pressure in both tires, give the gear a visual check. The strut should be clean, with a clearance between pin centers of 10 inches. And the shimmy damper must be full. That's important. Make sure the rod is almost up to the notch in the gauge on the shimmy damper reservoir. Now you can look over the engine cowlings on your way to the other main landing wheel. This gets the same inspection you've already given its mate. The co-pilot ducks into the wheel well to inspect the equipment there, while you work on the wheels. Measure tire pressures again. On these tires, the pressure should be between 75 and 85 pounds per square inch. Inside the wheel well, the co-pilot examines the wires, connections, and switches. He makes sure all the cannon plugs are on tight, paying particular attention to the plugs on this motor, which opens and closes the nacelle doors, and also to the plugs of the normal and emergency landing gear motors. Then he turns around to examine his side of the strut. he looks it over and inspects the brake lines, making sure that the hose is not chafing and no fluid is leaking. Meanwhile, you're checking the clearance between pin centers again. 13 1/4 inches. Right. Now, are the wheel chocks in place? One behind the inboard tire and one in front of the outboard tire, just as it should be. Next, check the cowlings, inspection doors, and inspection plates. You've already examined some of them, but you must be sure all of them are okay. The other members of the crew help you out with these inspections. Here, for example, a gunner tests the fastening of the top cowling. But you'll have to check the security of the other coverings, and there are a lot of them all over this ship. While you're walking along, you can examine the wing seams. Fluid leaking from them means trouble. Now to check the ailerons and trim tabs. All control surfaces and all trim tabs must be inspected. Test the tabs for excessive hinge play by shaking them, and see that the gas tank caps are tightened. If there were extra fuel tanks in the bomb bays, their connections would have to be examined. But now the pilot and the co-pilot continue their tour around the plane. They have a lot to check: hatches, windows, control surfaces, trim tabs, inspection plates, and doors. But the pilot and co-pilot aren't the only crew members with inspections to make. The gunners, for example, besides helping the pilot check the airplane, must also be sure the guns and gun cameras will work properly. They must inspect all 5 turrets in the same way they're now examining this lower rear turret. After they have the dome and gun cover removed, they see that the ammunition moves freely in the chutes and is correctly loaded. The guns just don't fire with the cartridges in backwards. They also check the safety wiring on the gun mounting bolts, up in there. Then the gun charging switches are put on reset. That conserves the CO2 pressure, which automatically charges the guns. Finally, the gun camera is inspected. Enough film, speed set at 16 frames per second, lens adjusted to the brightness of the day, and the interval control put at the desired number of seconds and turned on. And this turret is all right. The dome and gun cover can be replaced. The tail turret is checked by the tail gunner, but again the pilot is responsible. If the guns fail, he gets the blame. So he watches the tail gunner as the Shatterall feed mechanism is inspected. Now the other gunners only have to lock the latches. Elevation latch locked. Azimuth latch locked. The doors are shut and fastened, and the gunners can go to another turret. And there's still more work to be done. Each engine must be pulled through 15 blades, with only 2 men per blade. The engineer takes care of that. He sits at his position, making sure that all switches are off, while the 4 engines are pulled through. And now the co-pilot puts on his clothing and collects his equipment before joining the rest of the crew for inspection. Notice that the crew members wear fatigues while making their inspections, and change into flight clothing only when they are ready to enter the plane. The examination of the exterior of the airplane is completed, so the crew can fall in for the check of their personal equipment. That's the last item of the before entering the airplane part of the procedure, and it's strictly the pilot's job. Your job. You are responsible for the men as well as the plane. If they fail, you're at fault. Each crew member must have his electrically heated flying clothing, parachute, oxygen mask, knife, a quart of water, and Mae West. Steel helmets and flak vests are already inside the ship at the positions. Apparently these men are completely equipped. But don't think they only have to climb into the ship and fly away. There's a lot yet to be done. Let's go along with the pilot again and see what he has to do to take a B-29 into the air. He climbs in through the hatch in the nose wheel well. That entrance is also used by the co-pilot, engineer, navigator, radio operator, and bombardier. There's work for every man before the engines are started, during engine starting and warm-up, before takeoff, after takeoff, and then a whole list of additional things to do before landing again. As soon as the radio operator gets in, he climbs back to close the pressure door between the forward compartment and the forward bomb bay. The bombardier is the last one in, so he closes the hatch. The gunners close the pressure doors in their compartment. They also open the cabin pressure valves, which will now automatically maintain the cabin pressure at the desired level. 3 compartments in the plane the pilot's compartment, the gun control compartment, and the tail gunner's compartment are sealed off from the rest of the fuselage and supplied with this compressed air. The cabin pressurizer keeps 8,000 feet altitude inside the plane until the outside is at 30,000 feet. If the plane gets higher than 30,000 feet, the pressure inside drops off gradually, but it is always 13.4 inches of mercury more than the outside pressure. But let's get back to flight procedure. The gunners take care of the other pressure door in their compartment. But what about the pilot? That's you. You already have your chute fastened, your May West on, and the seat adjusted. So you put your throat microphone and earphones on. If you put the mic on first, you won't get so badly tangled in the wires. Don't forget to plug in your disconnector cord. Now to start work. Ask the engineer for Forms 1, 1A, and 01-1-40 and look them over. Be sure that everything on Forms 1 and 1A has been checked. Pay particular attention to the list of defective equipment. If anything vital is out of order, it must be fixed before taking off. The weight and balance computation is in Form 01-1-40. That's important. Make sure it's correct. When you've examined all the forms and signed them, you can give them back to the engineer and tell him to start the putt-putt. You have to turn on the emergency ignition switch. The tail gunner looks after the putt-putt, starting and stopping it on orders from the engineer. But now, you set the jackbox selector switch to command and turn on the proper command receiver and the command transmitter. This puts you in communication with the control tower. Now examine your own equipment. Look over your oxygen mask and make sure your portable oxygen bottle is fully charged. Then try out the cockpit lights. To test the ultraviolet lamps, turn on the switches and twist the shutter. You should then be able to see the light. By turning the shutter back, you can control the amount of ultraviolet light emitted. Next, try out the alarm bell. The gun commander will tell you if it's working. Then depress the brake pedals and pull out the parking brake knob to set the brakes. Look over to the control stand and make sure that the emergency releases and switches are correctly set. Power transfer switch, emergency landing gear release, emergency bomb release, emergency cabin air pressure release, and pilot's over control. Now unlock the control surfaces and throttles by moving the locking lever on the aisle stand full forward. Then release the throttle brake and test all 4 throttles through their entire range. Take it easy, move them slowly and gently. All controls on the B-29 should be handled in this careful manner in order to prevent damage to the mechanism. There's no need to push hard. And the co-pilot doesn't just sit and read the checklist. He must test the action of the control surfaces, moving each surface, elevators, ailerons, and rudder through the complete range. The gun commander looks from his blister, observing the response of the surfaces, and reports to the co-pilot. A similar test is made on the trim tabs. The co-pilot turns the 3 control wheels as far as they will go in each direction. That big wheel on the side of his control stand operates the elevator tabs. The aileron and rudder wheels are on top of the control stand behind the throttles. The way the trim tabs follow the setting of the control wheels is also observed by the gun commander, who tells the co-pilot over the interphone how the tabs move. The co-pilot turns the tabs back to neutral after testing them. And now to try out the wing flaps. But first he calls the side gunners on the interphone to make sure none of the service crew will be in the way of the descending flaps. When the gunners report that it's safe to go ahead, the co-pilot presses the flap switch to the down position and holds it there until the flaps have been lowered 15 degrees. 15 degrees is enough to tell if they're working all right. The co-pilot can't see the flaps, of course, so he watches the wing flap position indicator. But the gunners can check visually. They tell the co-pilot if the flaps come down all right. So now he can bring them back up. The gunners, again, will tell him when they're up. Don't start thinking the gunners have nothing to do but watch control surfaces and flaps. They have their own checklists to follow. The right side gunner, for example, is looking over his supply of spare lamps and fuses. Yep, that's okay. But now you, the pilot, are almost ready to start the engines. See that the automatic pilot master switch is off. Check over the 4 sets of control surface adjustment knobs, making sure all their pointers are up. Then set the manifold pressure selector to the 0 position. And depress all 4 propeller RPM switches to the increased position and hold them there until the lights on the co-pilot's instrument panel flash. Now you're all ready to start the engines, and the rest of the crew should be too. They check in with the co-pilot, reporting in this sequence. Bombardier, who sits directly ahead of the pilot and co-pilot. Navigator, who is some distance behind the pilot, facing forward. Flight engineer, who is directly behind the co-pilot, facing aft. Radio operator, who sits across from the navigator and faces the right wall. Gun commander, who is in the top of the fuselage amidships and can face in any direction. Left gunner, who faces aft. Right gunner, who also faces aft. And the tail gunner, who stays close to the putt-putt during takeoff and landing. His combat position, of course, is in the tail. Everybody set now. Warn the service crew outside you're going to start the engines, and tell the engineer to start number 1. And number 1 engine spins twice. And now he turns the fuel boost pump on, closes all the throttles except number 1, sets the fire extinguisher to number 1 engine, presses the starter switch to energize, and then flips it to start, and finally turns the magneto switch to both. You have to push the throttle to 1200 RPM and signal for number 2. The same procedure is repeated until all 4 engines are running. Now that the engines are going, vacuum pressure is available to operate your gyro flight instruments. So the gyro compass and the flight indicator can be uncaged and set. The co-pilot will be doing the same with his gyro instruments. Next, see if the other vacuum pump is working all right. Have the engineer switch to the pump on the number 2 engine. The vacuum may drop some, but it should go back to about 4 inches. Now you can call the control tower on the command radio. It's already on. This is about the right time to get your taxiing instructions, since you'll soon be ready to move out to the runway. At the same time, ask for the field barometric pressure so you can adjust the altimeter. It must be set carefully to the correct pressure, in this case, 29.84 inches. Obviously, an accurate altimeter is a vital necessity, especially if you may have to fly on instruments. Next, you want the bombardier. You know he sits back with the navigator and the radio operator until the ship is in the air. But right now he has to come forward to make the final checks on the bomb sight. He's already completed the regular pre-flight inspection of his equipment. All he must do now is see that the bomb sight is entirely ready for takeoff. The directional clutch should be disengaged and the secondary clutch engaged by turning it clockwise. Then the drum wheel must be turned counterclockwise as far as it will go. That does it. He's all set to take off. And now you're ready to close the bomb bay doors. Ask the ground crew outside if there are any obstructions underneath the plane. Everything's clear, so you can order the bombardier to close the bomb bay doors. He throws the door switch, while you look back through the pressure door to watch them shut. The rear bomb bay door is looked after by one of the gunners, who will tell you when it's closed. When both doors are shut, the bombardier can go back to his takeoff position in the rear of the compartment. And you're almost ready to taxi. But you better make one last check of the turret warning lights. Uh-oh, that lower rear turret light is on. Call one of the side gunners and have him take care of it. Perhaps the turret wasn't stowed. Forget about it, gunner? Well, it's easy to fix. Get control of the turret, press the action switch, and stow it. That does it. There, that turret warning light is off now. And everybody's set. Switch your jack box back to command and signal the ground crew outside to remove the wheel chocks and get a safe distance away from the airplane. The co-pilot warns the crew to stand by to taxi. And you can release the brakes and move the ship out to the runway. While taxiing, or whenever the plane is moving, all crew members watch from the windows and keep the pilot informed of obstructions. The gunners can provide the most help since the blisters give them a wide view. This is a big airplane. It's mighty easy to hit a fuel truck or another ship and clip off part of the wing or stabilizer, and that doesn't help the flying characteristics a bit. Notice the flaps are kept in the up position. If you taxi with them down, the undersurfaces are likely to be damaged by pebbles blown back by the propellers. After you've stopped at the edge of the runway, put in your call to the control tower for permission to taxi on the runway. When the tower has given the clearance, move on the runway. Steer with the outboard engines, not the brakes. Excessive use of the brakes on a plane as heavy as this one will wear them out quickly. As the ship is turned around at the far end of the runway, notice again how the engines are used for steering. You can see the right propellers moving faster than the left. When you're at right angles to the runway, stop for the engine run-up. Tell the flight engineer to get ready to make his magneto check while you run the engines up, one at a time. First, press the propeller RPM switches to the increased position, holding them there until all the propellers are at maximum RPM. Next, turn the manifold pressure selector to position 8. With the knob in this position, the superchargers automatically provide military power. Now advance the number 1 throttle, but slowly and gently, to 2000 RPM. Hold this speed until the engineer tells you the magneto check is finished. Then press the propeller RPM switch to the decreased position until the tachometer drops about 200 RPM. Now flip the switch to the increased position and hold it there until the light on the co-pilot's instrument panel flashes, and then push the throttle to full open. The tachometer should show about 2600 RPM for the number 1 engine, while manifold pressure should be around 47 inches. To see if the turbo is working properly, turn the manifold pressure selector towards 0. That should make the manifold pressure drop. The turbo's okay. Bring the throttle back to idling, around 550 to 600 RPM, and increase speed to 1200 to avoid fouling the spark plugs. Next, start on the number 2 engine. This same procedure is repeated for each engine. Now you're about set to take off. After you're cleared for takeoff, turn the plane the rest of the way around so that it points down the runway. And stop again while the co-pilot lowers the wing flaps about 25 degrees. He can tell when they're right by looking at the wing flap position indicator. And the gunners can check on the accuracy of the indicator by watching the flaps from their blisters. They report on the approximate flap position over the interphone. When the co-pilot tells you the flaps are okay, fasten your safety belt and set the manifold pressure selector to position 8. Next, set the propeller RPM switches to increase RPM and wait for the lights on the co-pilot instrument panel to flash. Then warn the engineer to be ready for takeoff. Stand by for takeoff. Now you push on the brakes, hard, and open the throttle slowly until the manifold pressure gauge reads about 40 inches. Then release the brakes. As you gather speed, slowly advance the throttles to full power and set the throttle brake. Manifold pressure should go up to 47 or 47.5 inches. RPM should go up to 2600. Continue accelerating down the runway until the indicated airspeed gets up to 95 miles per hour. Then slowly pull the control column back, putting the ship in a flying attitude. The plane takes off without further action on your part when it gets flying speed. The exact speed at which it will leave the ground depends on the weight. When the ship is airborne, apply the brakes to stop the wheels, and then have the co-pilot retract the landing gear. He has to hold the landing gear retracting switch in the up position because the switch is spring-loaded. The co-pilot makes sure the nose gear is up by looking through the inspection door on the floor of the cockpit, just ahead of the aisle stand. The wheel is there, all right. At 160 miles per hour and 500 feet altitude, the co-pilot retracts the flaps, snapping the switch on and off until the indicator shows that the flaps are all the way up. The side gunners should be watching from their blisters as the plane takes off. They tell the co-pilot when the flaps and landing gear are up. Now you ought to change from takeoff power setting to climbing. Adjust the manifold pressure selector until the manifold pressure drops to 43 inches. And decrease propeller RPM to bring the tachometers to 2400. You can order the engineer to have the putt-putt turned off now, and tell the bombardier to come forward and take his combat position in the nose of the ship. If this is an operational flight and enemy opposition is expected, have the men put on their flak vests. These vests are made of small overlapping links of tough steel sewn inside canvas. Quilting on the inside of the canvas provides further protection and also cushions the shock of impact. Above 10,000 feet, oxygen masks must be worn by one man in each compartment. When you reach the desired altitude, level off and tell the engineer to set up cruising conditions. First, you move the throttles back to about 65% of full power. Individual manipulation of the throttles may be necessary to keep each engine at the same manifold pressure. Now you adjust the propellers and manifold pressure, so turn the controls over to the co-pilot. Start with the props. Press the propeller RPM switches to decrease and bring all 4 propellers to 2000 RPM. Then turn the manifold pressure selector down until the manifold pressure drops to 30 inches. The needles should stay together in this case. There you are, 30 inches. Considerable juggling of throttles, propellers, and supercharger may be necessary before you get it just right, but that's how you get a B-29 into the air. It's a big, heavy, and powerful airplane. Bigger, heavier, and more powerful than anything you've ever flown. For that reason, it must be handled gently and precisely. You must carefully follow the prescribed procedures. Even a super bomber is no good to the Army if it's in little busted-up pieces. But don't get jittery. The 29 is a sweet ship to handle. When it stalls, the nose drops so that the plane automatically recovers. There's no tendency to spin. Stalling speed varies quite a bit naturally depending on weight and other conditions, but generally it's between 84 and 135 miles per hour. When turning or executing any maneuver, take it easy. This is a big plane, remember, not a fighter. Yet fairly steep turns can be made safely. This 30-degree bank can also be done with full flaps. That's about the limit. And when evasive action is necessary, you have plenty of tricks to pull. Just watch this B-29. And the B-29 does more than just fly well. It packs a terrific wallop. A wallop enemy fighters will quickly learn to fear. That turret you see moving is only one of the 5 on the ship, which mounts a total of 10 machine guns and 1 cannon. 4 of the turrets, 2 on top and 2 beneath the fuselage, can turn through 360 degrees in azimuth, 90 degrees in elevation. The tail turret is more restricted in movement, but it has a 20mm cannon in addition to the twin 50s the others carry. But the big thing about the 29's armament is the fact that the gunners don't touch the guns. The guns are controlled remotely from special sights, and any gunner can fire almost any turret. For example, one side gunner might have control of 2 turrets, firing 4 caliber 50s at his target. That's only the beginning of the story about guns, so let's get back to what a pilot has to do. Now you're ready to land. Since you've descended below 10,000 feet, remove your oxygen mask. Tell the co-pilot to take over control of the ship so that you can get out of your flak vest. The vest is easy to take off. Just pull on the cord and it drops away. This speed of removal becomes important if you ever have to bail out, since the vest is worn over the parachute and, well, you figure it out. If you've been riding with the automatic pilot, turn it off. You can't use it for landing, of course, or when taking off, flying turbulent weather, or setting trim tabs. The co-pilot should now warn the crew to prepare for landing, and tell the bombardier to climb out of his seat in the nose and get in back with the engineer. Then the co-pilot has the engineer start the putt-putt. You check the turret warning lights. All the lights are off. Then call the control tower and get landing instructions. At the same time, ask for the field barometric pressure and set the altimeter to correspond. Now the co-pilot hits the brakes to test the hydraulic pressure. Both normal and emergency systems should have 800 to 1,000 pounds. To find out about the emergency pressure, you have to ask the engineer. At the same time, you can see if he's ready to land and get his log. He has calculated the new weight and center of gravity, since you've used up a lot of gasoline by now. You should look the log over, but the co-pilot will check it carefully, examining the center of gravity and weight computations. The table on the instrument panel gives the stalling speed for the computed weight. The co-pilot tells you the stalling speed and also reports that everybody in the crew is ready to land. Next, you adjust the propeller RPM switches. Push them to increase until you get the tachometers to show 2100 RPM. Now adjust the manifold pressure selector to give you plenty of reserve power. Turn it all the way up to position 8, the setting for full military power. When the plane is slowed down to 180 miles per hour or less, order the co-pilot to lower the landing gear. When the switch is set to the down position, the wheels descend all the way, lock, and the gear motors automatically stop. When the left and right gear are down, the side gunners, who should now be watching the wheels and flaps, will report to the co-pilot. He himself can make sure the nose wheel has been lowered all the way by looking through the window in the floor of the cockpit. Next, the flaps should come down. If you've been in combat, the co-pilot should lower them first only 5 degrees. If they were damaged, lowering them all the way might rip them off the wing. The gunners can look them over and report on their condition. The flaps are all right, so the co-pilot can lower them 25 degrees. Notice that he snaps the switch on and off. That way, the flaps descend gradually, and a sudden change in the lift characteristics of the airplane is avoided. The gunners will report when the flaps appear to be down 25 degrees, and the co-pilot can check by looking at his wing flap position indicator. When he has the flaps where he wants them, he'll tell you. Then you'll probably have to reset the trim tabs because of the change in the flap position. Next, adjust the throttle brake to a comfortable tension. And don't forget to turn off the detonator power switch. Now make a standard approach, keeping the speed about 30 miles per hour above stalling. And, on the final approach, order the co-pilot to lower the flaps all the way. When you touch the ground, the plane should be slightly tail low and going between 95 and 100 miles per hour. Notice how the main wheels bear most of the shock of landing. Then the ship slowly settles forward. Don't apply brakes immediately. Let the plane lose some of its speed rolling. Then turn the manifold pressure selector all the way back to 0. You won't need the turbos anymore. And set the propellers at increase RPM. Raise the flaps now, while you're taxiing and have plenty of power. You're down now. You've followed your checklist step by step. But there are other checklists, the engineers, for example. So suppose we go back over that landing procedure and see how the engineer's checklist fits in with yours. 5 minutes before landing, the engineer tells the tail gunner to start the putt-putt. The ship enters the traffic pattern at a 45-degree angle to the downwind leg. Altitude is 2760, speed is 180. Here the co-pilot lowers the wheels. The mixture controls are set to auto-rich, and the cowl flaps open 15 degrees. At the end of the downwind leg, the speed should be about 140 or 150, and at least 3 generators must be on. The co-pilot lowers the flaps 15 degrees. After the pilot makes the procedure turn, the altitude should be 2260 feet. The co-pilot lowers the flaps to 25 degrees. The pilot sets the manifold pressure selector to position 8 and adjusts the propellers to 2100 RPM. Just before the final turn, the engineer checks the magnetos and turns the boost pumps on. Around the turn, on the final approach, speed should be at least 140, altitude 800 feet. Also, 6 generators should be on. Finally, the co-pilot lowers the flaps all the way and calls out airspeed and hydraulic pressure as the ship descends to the runway. After the airplane's on the ground, turbos come off and propellers are set to full increase RPM. The engineer switches the boost pumps off and opens the cowl flaps all the way. All right, we're back where we were before. Tell the bombardier to come forward and open the bomb bay doors. The doors should always be kept open when the ship is standing still to prevent the accumulation of gas fumes. Next, turn off all the switches. Then you can get rid of some of your equipment that remains inside the ship and climb out for the after-flight inspection. Yes, you start with an inspection and finish with an inspection. If there was anything wrong, now is the time to find out about it. And now is the time to correct it. Yes, this is the airplane that you've been promised. Now it's up to you to weld this airplane and its crew into a single, irresistible instrument of destruction. That can be your promise to us.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors, and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks' Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth, and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Superfortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. For more amazing aerial footage, and to join us in this incredible journey, check out the Dronescapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.
Along the unyielding road of time, in the span between past and future, certain events have seized human imagination and shaped his worldview. One such event occurred not long ago, a colossal war waged with machines that scarred the land, seas, and skies. This is the tale of one such machine. The B-29's roots trace back to Boeing's Model 316 project, a direct successor to the XB-15 of 1934. Additional designs emerged over the ensuing years, with the 345 design formally presented to the U.S. Army on May 11, 1940. The Army was sufficiently impressed to grant Boeing funds for further studies and wind tunnel tests on June 17th. 3 years and multiple designs later, the first B-29s began rolling off the production lines at Boeing's Wichita plant in Kansas. By September 1943, 2 other major companies were producing B-29s alongside Boeing. Martin operated from its Omaha plant in Nebraska, while Bell built them in Marietta, Georgia. Together, these 3 facilities delivered a total of 2,513 B-29s. Measuring 99 feet in length and spanning 141 feet 3 inches, the B-29 was anything but small. In fact, it was the largest bomber in the world, with a wing area of 1,736 square feet. Coupled with a height of 27 feet 9 inches, the aptly named Superfortress stood as a towering giant, weighing 74,500 pounds empty and 135,000 pounds fully loaded. Building such a colossal aircraft required vast amounts of space and a meticulously organized construction system. On the factory floor, hundreds of specially trained workers toiled to construct an aircraft of immense proportions. This diverse workforce included people from all walks of life. Individuals worked side by side while the older teamed up with the young and younger. No one was too old to contribute or too young to matter. Every person brought a valuable skill, regardless of their shape or size. Once assembled, these frame sections came together to form the world's heaviest bomber, and getting such a machine airborne required immense power. That power came from 4 Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone 18-cylinder radial engines, each equipped with GE turbo superchargers, delivering 2,200 horsepower at takeoff and 2,300 horsepower at 25,000 feet. The frame supporting these engines had to be expertly constructed. A single missed rivet combined with vibrations from the engines could cause the entire plane to break apart mid-air. Once fully assembled, the B-29 was nearly ready to depart the plant. Only minimal finishing touches remained, as it was built as a machine of war, requiring little in terms of paintwork or aesthetic details. On a production line like this, completed planes didn't remain idle for long. The moment the final rivet was secured, the B-29 was towed out of the factory and handed over to the men who would ultimately gamble their lives on its reliability. The pilots destined to fly these formidable warbirds left nothing to chance. The B-29 underwent a rigorous series of tests before its first flight. Every inch of its exterior assembly had to be meticulously inspected by the pilot and crew, who ensured nothing was overlooked. Tire pressure had to be precise, maintained between 75 and 85 pounds